Happy Friday! It's time for another audiobook. And today's audiobook is The Cowboy Billionaire, which right now is the last book in the Sweet Billionaires series. You never know when I might go back and write some more billionaires. But right now it's the last one. So it's got cowboys, it's got billionaires, it's got small towns, it's an enemies to lovers trope. And I think you guys will enjoy it. So have a listen. Let me know what you think.
Chapter 1 Hunter. Hunter Garrison flashed his megawatt smile into the rearview mirror as he put the car in park and turned off the engine. He was living the American dream. Well, maybe not exactly the American dream. The money that should be his still wasn't, but only because his father had put a crazy stipulation in his will that stated Hunter had to prove himself before he could get his money. Unfortunately, Hunter had no idea what that meant. As far as he was concerned, he proved himself every day. But so far, it hadn't been whatever his father had been looking for. Still, he lacked little, and one day the entire company would be his. Climbing out of the car, he brushed his hands down his sleek Armani suit to extinguish any wrinkles. Though it had been pressed this morning, sometimes the trip to work was enough to create a small wrinkle or leave him with an unsightly piece of lint. He supposed with his money he could have someone drive him around, but he enjoyed being behind the wheel, feeling the leather of the steering wheel against his hands and the soft purr of the engine reverberating in his bones. Besides, if someone else drove him, he would miss seeing his name on the sign. Spot reserved for Hunter Garrison. It had been a gift from the board when his father died. He would have preferred access to all the money, but having his own designated spot had its perks, especially on busy days. Today was not one of those busy days. In fact, it was shaping up to be not only one of his better days, but one of his most relaxing. He'd had no meeting scheduled until 10, so he'd rewarded himself with an extra hour of sleep. Then, his favorite Def Leppard song had been playing on his alarm clock to wake him up. He'd bought one of those fancy AI alarm clocks for himself last Christmas. It had taken him a few hours to figure out how to set it up, but now he wondered how he had ever lived without it. After programming in his favorite songs, he simply had to tell the clock when to wake him the next morning. It then analyzed the tone of his voice and picked a suitable song for the morning. It never ceased to amaze Hunter how the song choice almost always fit his mood. To top it all off, he'd hit no traffic lights on the way to work this morning, which meant he had plenty of time to enjoy his coffee. These were the days he enjoyed the most. He always had one cup of coffee at home, just to wake him up. But it wasn't as good as the stuff his assistant brought him. When he had time to sit and drink the good stuff peacefully at work, everything seemed to go better. As he reached the door that led into the building, he gave himself one last glance to make sure his hair still held the effortlessly tousled look he strived for every morning. His dark brown hair was his favorite feature, and from the compliments he received on it, it was the ladies' favorite feature on him as well. Satisfied that it hadn't moved from its proper place, he pulled open the door and stepped into the lobby. Hunter loved everything about this building: the sleek look, the many windows, the elegant color scheme. But the thing he loved the most was that it was his, at least in name. The board might still run the daily activities, but that was only temporary. One day, it would all be his. Until then, he enjoyed the looks of awe and jealous smiles that were flashed in his direction as he made his way up to the penthouse floor where his office resided and looked out at the beautiful city. "Good morning, Mr. Garrison," Bree, one of the receptionists, said as he passed her desk. She was a petite brunette with horn-rimmed glasses and a dusting of freckles. Pretty, but a little sweet for his taste. Today she wore a pink suit coat over a white blouse that reminded him of cotton candy. Though he was seeing someone on a fairly regular basis, he turned and flashed her a wink. He would never date Bree, but he loved to hear her sigh as he walked away. "You really shouldn't lead her on like that," Davis, his friend, said as he fell into step beside him. Dressed in a black suit with a pale blue shirt, Davis could almost blend into the surroundings. Nothing about him stood out. Hunter rolled his eyes and flicked a dismissive hand. "Relax. She knows I'm only flirting. It's harmless fun, that's all." He punched the button for the elevator and smiled when it opened. No waiting on the elevator? It really was a good day. Davis shook his head as he stepped inside. "Still, one day I think that flirting is going to get you in trouble." Hunter liked Davis. They had been friends when they were younger, and his father had hired Davis around the time he began training Hunter. Their similarities definitely outweighed their differences, but this one difference often reared its ugly head. Hunter was outgoing, and perhaps a little flirty, but Davis was more reserved. Stiff might be the word Hunter would use. Still, he wasn't going to let Davis's caution ruin his good day. Hunter clapped a hand on the man's shoulder as the doors closed and the elevator began to move. "What could happen, Davis? She knows about Brittany. It's just a harmless crush, like the one you had on Miss Warren in 8th grade. Davis shook his head, but said nothing more as the car came to a stop and the doors opened on their floor. Hunter took a deep breath and stepped into the expansive foyer. The elegant gold and cream colors continued through this floor, and walking it always made him feel even wealthier than he was. He flashed Davis a goodbye wave as he continued toward his office. Val, his beautiful, curvy assistant, stood outside his door, wearing a tight skirt, a flowy blouse, and a large smile. Hunter was fairly certain she'd been hired more for her looks than her competence, but she had turned out to be a decent assistant and a killer coffee connoisseur. "Good morning, Mr. Garrison. Got it just the way you like it." The words flowed like honey from her ruby red lips, but Hunter was more interested in the coffee. "Thanks, Val. After the 10 o'clock, what's on the docket for today?" "You have a 2 o'clock to wrap up the property in Houston." Hunter nodded. Not a full schedule, but the first meeting had the probability of running long, which meant he would have little downtime. Sometimes that was good, though. It made the day go quicker. And he had a date planned with Brittany tonight. As if she were psychic, Hunter's cell buzzed in his pocket. "I've got to take this," he said to Val as he saw Brittany's number flash across the screen. "Thanks for the coffee." "Hey, baby," he said as he punched the button and held the phone to his ear. With the heel of his Scarasso shoe, he tapped his office door closed. "You still good for tonight?" "Yes, but I bought a new dress the other day and I don't have a purse to go with it. I'm at Gucci right now and they have a perfect one. Can I put it on the card?" "Sure." He'd been meaning to get her a little something nice for their 3-month anniversary anyway. Hunter wasn't sure Brittany was the woman he wanted to marry, but she kept the boredom away for now. "Consider it my anniversary gift to you." He held the phone a few inches away as she squealed on the other end. "Thanks, Hunter. You're the best. See you at 7?" "You bet, babe. Have fun shopping." "I will." The phone clicked in his ear before he had a chance to say anything more, but that was okay. He enjoyed making her happy, and he had the money to spend. Why not let her enjoy it some? He lifted his coffee cup to his mouth and let the warm liquid glide down his throat. Yes, Val's coffee always hit the spot. The intercom on his phone beeped, and he glanced at his watch as he set the cup down on his desk. He still had a few minutes before his meeting, so why was Val paging him? Had his appointment arrived early? He tapped the button and waited for the small click that let him know he was connected. "Yes, Val?" "Sorry to bother you, sir." There was a hesitation in her voice that he hadn't heard just moments ago, and it caused him to sit a little straighter in his black leather chair. "But Mr. Goldman would like to see you?" Goldman? What could he possibly want? Mr. Goldman was the head of the board and had been his father's right-hand man, but he almost never held meetings. Instead, he played putt golf in his office and delegated the rest of the duties. Though Hunter rarely got nervous, he felt his stomach twist slightly. Goldman was the only one who could give Hunter orders, though he seldom did. Did he say why? "No, sir." "Okay, I'll be right there." Hunter clicked off the intercom, took one more sip of his coffee, and lamented the fact it would probably be cold before he could return to it. However, taking it into a meeting with Mr. Goldman wasn't an option either. "Val, if my appointment arrives, will you ask them to wait?" he asked when he reached Val's desk. She issued a swift nod. "Of course." As Hunter continued toward Goldman's office, his anxiety grew. The last time he'd met with Goldman had been just after his father died, when Goldman had told him the company wouldn't truly be his until he met his father's stipulation. Goldman was the only one who knew what the stipulation was, but he'd refused to even give Hunter a hint. What could the man possibly want? Goldman's secretary glanced up as he pushed open the door. She was fierce and nearly as old as Goldman. In fact, she had been with the company for as long as Hunter could remember. Today, her white hair was pulled back in a severe bun, which did nothing to alleviate the wrinkles on her face. "Ah, Mr. Garrison, you made it. Mr. Goldman is waiting for you." She gestured to the closed office door with a swift flick of her wrist, but no calming smile. He wasn't sure the woman even remembered how to smile. True as it might be, that thought did nothing to tame the anxiety that now seemed to be clawing out of his stomach and up his throat. Though his collar was not tight, he hated ties and only wore them at meetings, he pulled at it to give his neck more air. As he pushed open the office door, he racked his mind for anything he could have done wrong. He had secured good deals and brought in even more money to the firm. Plus, Val double-checked everything he sent off to make sure it was spotless. She hadn't failed him yet. "You wanted to see me, sir?" "Shut the door behind you," Goldman said, without looking up from his desk. Memories of visits to the principal's office in elementary school flooded Hunter's mind. He had always been a good kid until the year his mother left. Then he'd become very familiar with the bland office that sat just beyond the cafeteria. Hunter shut the door, and the soft click finally garnered Goldman's full attention. He set down his pen, pushed up his small wire-framed glasses, and then folded his hands together on the table. "Mr. Garrison, it has come to my attention that you have a way with the women." The anxiety in his stomach eased, and he shrugged, an easy-going smile gracing his face. "I guess some people could see it that way. I certainly enjoy striking up conversations and seeing them smile." Goldman lifted an eyebrow, as if he either didn't believe Hunter or didn't understand his nonchalance. "I see. Well, I have an assignment for you." Hunter's smile faltered. An assignment? What did that mean? "What kind of assignment?" He sat a little straighter in his chair. Mr. Goldman's face remained emotionless. "We wish to acquire some land in Soda Spurs." "Soda Spurs? What do we want land there for? Where even is it?" Hunter had heard the name, but he couldn't place it on a map. Goldman steepled his hands and tapped his fingertips together. "Your father always wanted to open a dude ranch resort in Texas." A dude ranch? Hunter wasn't even sure what that entailed, but the request sounded like his late father. Though they had been close when Hunter's mom first left, his father had soon thrown himself into work, and the desire to earn money. The relationship between them had suffered, and as he grew older, his father had become even more eccentric, buying up properties that made no sense and waxing about lofty endeavors like a dude ranch when no one in the company had any knowledge of how to run one. Hunter, on the other hand, preferred to acquire businesses that would increase their profit, or land they could build luxury resorts on. I don't know what we would do with a dude ranch, but why don't we just purchase the land? We're bound to have the money. Mr. Goldman sat back and stared at Hunter. Time seemed to stretch out, and Hunter felt like an item at an auction bid with the way Goldman studied him. Finally, the man spoke. We have the money, but there is a woman who refuses to sell. Since you appear to get along well with the ladies, I thought perhaps you could convince her. Hunter leaned back in his chair and blinked as he tried to process the information. So, you want me to waltz into town and what? Talk the company up? Flirt with the woman? What? Goldman's head tilted down in a slight nod. Whatever it takes. You have suggested you can be convincing. Now prove it. Hunter nodded, excited at the thought of a challenge. What do we know about this woman? Goldman turned to his computer and tapped a few buttons. Her name is Daisy Keller. It appears the farm has been in the Keller family for years, so there must be some sentimental reason she doesn't want to sell. Hunter groaned inwardly. Sentimental reasons were the hardest to overcome. Okay, where exactly is Soda Spurs? A slight smile spread across Goldman's face. It's a few hours from here. So you think you can do it? Of course I can. Just don't make me manage the dude ranch. I don't like small towns, and I have no desire to be there any longer than necessary. Goldman nodded. You leave this afternoon. This afternoon? Hunter bit the inside of his lip. He had a date with Brittany tonight, and she would not be happy if he canceled. Is that a problem? Goldman asked, as if sensing Hunter's hesitation. I had a date planned, but I'm sure I can make it up to her. Just tell her this was your father's last wish. A small snort escaped Hunter's lips. Somehow I doubt she'll care much about that. Brittany hadn't seemed to care about his father at all, only the money that Hunter stood to inherit. Well, then buy her a gift when you return. There's an increase in your monthly draw for a job well done. Hunter didn't need an increase. Everything he wanted was at his fingertips, but there was no reason to turn down extra money. Besides, he had been fighting a feeling of boredom recently. He loved his life, but it was a little monotonous. This might be just the thing he'd been looking for, even though hanging out in a small town sounded about as appealing as caulking a bathroom. Not that he'd ever done that either, but it sounded boring. I'll make it happen, sir. You can count on me. After another nod from Goldman, Hunter returned to his office. Is everything okay? Val asked, worry etched into her facial features. It is, but I'm going to be away for a few days. He didn't think he would need much more time than that. Dealing with women was his specialty. Think you can handle things around here? She quirked an eyebrow at him, but assured him that she could. With that settled, Hunter entered his office and gathered his things. He needed to pack and let Brittany know he would have to reschedule their date for the night. She wouldn't be pleased, but perhaps the purse she'd purchased today would be enough to soothe her over until he got back. Chapter 2. Daisy. Daisy slapped the button to turn off the alarm and squeezed her eyes shut tighter. Why did today have to exist? Why couldn't she scrub it from the calendar and just pretend it never happened? Of course, life wasn't that simple, but it sure would be nice if it was. This day was hard enough for her, but she knew it would be even worse for Cody. Today marked the 1-year anniversary of his father's death, and while he had handled the last year remarkably well, she had no idea how he would handle today. Maybe she could get Fanny to distract him somehow, take him into town or something while she did the chores. Not that there was much to distract him in this town. Soda Spurs had seemed like the perfect town to set down roots and raise a family when it had been her and Ethan out to conquer the world. Small, welcoming, and close-knit, the town's atmosphere had sucked her in, and she'd agreed to taking over his father's ranch to continue the Keller legacy. As she'd looked across the land, she'd imagined their future children running across the sprawling land and showing animals through the 4-H club. And so, even though she'd known nothing about farming, or ranching at the time, she'd agreed to learn. It had proven challenging at first, but over time she'd enjoyed learning how to care for the animals, and even how to manage the business side of things. When Cody had come along, she'd worried about injuring herself while working, and she'd worried about Ethan having to work harder when she no longer could. But she hadn't worried much about the size of the town. In fact, even as she'd decorated the nursery, she'd imagined Cody's future and been excited about the prospect of small classes and lifelong friends for him. And he did have 2 very close friends. Or at least he had until last year when Ethan was killed. Then Cody had turned from an energetic 7-year-old into a moody, reserved 8-year-old who rarely hung out with his friends. Now the quaint town felt entirely too small, with nothing to distract Cody from his torturous thoughts, and the sprawling ranch felt too big, with most of the work falling on Daisy's shoulders. Add the mounting bills to that, and Daisy wished she could just pull the blanket back over her head and spend the day in bed. Unfortunately, that wasn't possible, so she took a deep breath and pushed her blanket back. As she stepped out of bed, the smell of pancakes met her nose. She didn't know how many times she'd told Fanny that she didn't need to make breakfast every day, but the woman insisted, and today, Daisy was grateful. Pancakes were Cody's favorite breakfast, and though they wouldn't stave his sadness for the whole day, perhaps they could for a time. Fanny was Ethan's aunt, and she'd been a part of Daisy's life since the day she'd met Ethan. The woman was definitely getting older, as her gray hair and wrinkles attested to, but spunky was still the best word to describe her, and she had offered to come and live at the ranch to help take care of Cody when Ethan died. Daisy had been more than happy to accept the help, and stated Fanny needn't go out of her way with anything other than helping Cody, but Fanny insisted on helping out around the house as well, probably to prove she was still capable. Daisy couldn't say that she minded. With most of her time spent making sure the ranch kept running, she no longer had the time she once did to deal with dishes and keeping the house in order. She had never expected to be a single parent, and certainly hadn't been prepared for how hard it was. Padding to her closet, she marveled at how different it looked from just 10 years ago. Before she'd met Ethan, she'd loved the city and thought she would remain there forever. Her closet then had been filled with designer suits and dresses, but there was no need for those in Soda Spurs, Texas. No, jeans and t-shirts were more suitable here. She grabbed her favorite pair of jeans, a little impractical with the beaded design on the back pocket, and pulled them on. No doubt Fanny would lecture her once again about the unnecessary bedazzling, but Daisy couldn't help it. She might not have a man any longer, but she did still have the desire to feel pretty. After adding a comfy tea that read, "Coffee perks me up, but Jesus makes me smile," she brushed her teeth and pulled her long blonde hair into a loose ponytail. Though she couldn't wear it up long due to the headaches that ensued, it was definitely easier to do her chores without it flying in her face. The Texas wind could be brutal at times, with few trees to slow down its fierce gusting. "Ah, you're just in time," Fanny said with a smile as Daisy entered the kitchen. Her gray hair was pulled up in a tidy bun, and a brightly colored apron covered her long dress. Cody, in a complete opposite presentation to her mood, sat at the table, his chin propped on his hands and a scowl on his face. Daisy's brows lifted at the mound of pancakes Fanny carried in her arms. Why on earth had she made so many? Am I? That looks like more than we can eat. Are we inviting the town for breakfast? That's what I said when I asked her if I could eat 10 minutes ago, Cody grumbled. She said I had to wait. Fanny set the pancakes in the middle of the table, ignoring Cody and turning to Daisy. Don't be ridiculous. This isn't enough to feed the town. But it's certainly more than we need, Aunt Fanny. Daisy grabbed the butter from the fridge and the syrup from the pantry and placed them on the table before patting Cody on the head and pulling out a chair for herself. Fanny had already set plates, utensils, and drinks on the table. Why did you make so many? Fanny sighed as she sat down. I guess I'm still used to cooking for a big family. I had 8 children, remember? And even after they left, I still cooked on occasion for you and Ethan before... Her voice trailed off, but Daisy knew what she meant. Before Ethan had been killed in a car accident. That's when life had changed. For all of them. Daisy shot a quick glance at Cody, but his gaze remained focused on his plate. Anyway, Fanny said with a shake of her head, they make good leftovers. Besides, I figured we could make sure the men had a good breakfast today. Some of them are starting to look too skinny. Though Fanny had meant it as a joke, her words sobered Daisy. Ethan had always employed at least 10 men when he ran the ranch, but Daisy wasn't sure how. When the lawyer went over the will with her, she'd figured there was money from his life insurance to continue running the farm. But evidently, Ethan had taken out a few loans for equipment. Once they were paid and the funeral was covered, there wasn't much left. As much as she hadn't wanted to, she'd been forced to let a few of the men go. Now there were only 3, and they lived in a bunkhouse out back, which had its own kitchen. They did most of their own cooking, and they didn't look famished, but there would be no convincing Aunt Fanny. Daisy was certain Fanny just enjoyed being useful again. After raising 8 children, she'd been on her own for the last several years. She'd visited often before Ethan had been killed, but she'd kept her own small house on the other side of town. Rocking and knitting had filled most of her time, but she must have been lonely because she'd jumped at the opportunity to help out when Daisy had made the offer last year. Well, I'm sure they will appreciate the food, Aunt Fanny. Fanny tisked as she lowered her head to pray, but Daisy did not miss the slight pink that colored her cheeks. I'm no Norma, but home-cooked food is home-cooked food. Yes, it is. Norma owned one of the local restaurants, and while Daisy wasn't as fond of her food as Fanny was, she certainly couldn't argue that home-cooked food was better than eating out every day. She had rarely had home-cooked food in the city, and having grown up there, she wasn't much of a cook herself. She'd learned enough to get by, but Fanny's food was definitely better. Her wardrobe even agreed, as she'd managed to shed 20 pounds in the last year, even though she hadn't stepped in a gym. Whether that was Fanny's cooking, grief, or her new extra work on the ranch, she wasn't sure, but she would take it. If only she could find a way to make the ranch profitable again. A company hoping to buy the land had already come calling, but Daisy wasn't willing to give up yet, not without a fight. Her stomach rumbled, and she closed her eyes to pray so she could eat. No way would she dare touch her food before she'd prayed, at least not in front of Fanny. The first day she had eaten with Fanny and reached for the food before praying, Fanny had smacked her hand with her fork and lectured her on always giving thanks to God first. But Daisy appreciated the woman's conviction and traditional ways. When the prayer ended, Daisy echoed her amen and nudged Cody to do the same when he remained silent. She wished she had words to make him feel better, but this was new territory for her as well. Cody, why don't you see if David or Gabe can come over today? I could probably take you all riding this afternoon. Cody shrugged and stabbed a bite of pancake with his fork. David's out of town visiting his grandma. Okay, what about Gabe? He offered another non-committal shrug. I don't know. I don't really feel like writing. Talking to him was like pulling teeth lately. Well, I need to make a run to the general store, Fanny said, catching Daisy's hint. You want to come with me? I'll let you pick a carton of ice cream for after dinner tonight. Cody glanced up, and for a second Daisy thought he might agree, but a moment later a sigh slipped past his lips, and he dropped his head again. No, that's okay. I think I'll just play on my computer and read a little. The women exchanged glances across the table. Daisy didn't like for Cody to stay inside all day, but she didn't have the energy to fight the battle today. She figured she could give him this day to wallow in his grief. Starting tomorrow, she'd start taking him out with her. He was young, but there were jobs he could do, like feeding the animals and checking the stalls. When breakfast was finished, Cody slipped out of the kitchen as Daisy helped Fanny clear the table and set the dishes in the sink. Something has to be done about that boy, Fanny said, as she began rinsing the dishes. Daisy sighed. I know. I just wish I knew what. Give him today to grieve, though. I'll take him out with me tomorrow. Maybe one of the men can take him under their wing. She hated to ask that of one of her employees. They already did so much for her, but she was desperate. Fanny placed a hand on Daisy's arm. God will figure something out. Just keep praying about it. Daisy nodded, and though she had been praying, her faith was no longer as strong as Fanny's. It felt like she'd been praying forever with no answer in sight. She needed help now. The sun was already shining brightly when Daisy headed out to the barn. It wasn't expected to be a scorcher today, but the Texas sun always felt warm, and the barn would feel at least 10 degrees hotter. She gazed longingly at her horse Mina before continuing to the food troughs. Riding Mina was her favorite part of her day, but she needed to make sure the animals were fed first. After feeding the horses, the pigs, and the cows, and gathering the eggs from the chickens, Daisy brushed down the horses, ending with Mina. Then she saddled her up and led her out of the barn. A smile spread across Daisy's freckled face as she tilted her head up slightly to let the sun caress her with its warmth. This was the best part of her day. Well, one of them. Out here, away from the stress of chores, money, and what to do about Cody, she could relax and pretend to be carefree again, like she had been when Ethan was alive. She had always enjoyed riding with Ethan, and she missed having him by her side. But she was glad she still had this, the freedom, the land, the time. If only she could find a way to mend hers and Cody's heart and save the ranch. As Daisy led Mina toward the perimeter of the property, her eyes scanned the fence for any broken posts or sagging places. But as usual, her employees had it well under control. If she ever made it out of the red, she would find a way to thank them, because she knew they were working harder now that the staff was fewer. Up ahead, she saw Carlos repairing a batch of wire. Carlos had immigrated from Mexico in the last few months and was working hard to send money back to his family until they could afford to come over as well. Daisy pulled the mare to a stop and dismounted. She pushed her hat back slightly with one hand. Morning, Carlos. How's it going today? A wide smile spread across Carlos's face. His smile was charming, but his teeth could desperately use some help. It was clear that he hadn't seen a dentist in a long time, if ever. One day, she hoped to have enough money to send him to see one. Unfortunately, at the moment, she didn't even have enough money to see one herself. She pushed the negative thought away and pasted a smile on her face. He had his own stress and didn't need to be worrying about hers as well. Morning, Miss Daisy. I can't complain much. The sun's not too hot today and the animals are behaving. Carlos was right about that. The Texas sun normally burned much brighter by this time in June. But for some reason, they were experiencing slightly cooler temperatures this week. Daisy wouldn't complain, though. Cooler temperatures meant less stress on the animals and her water bill. Plus, she had never enjoyed the feeling of sweat trickling down her spine and pooling at her waist. "Enjoy it while you can, Carlos. I heard the temperature is supposed to go up again next week." "Oh, I will, Miss Daisy. God's been too good to me for me not to enjoy each day given to me." This was the other reason she loved Carlos. He, like Fanny, helped her keep perspective. Though his family was far away, he still greeted each day with a smile and gave 110% of himself on the job. Whenever Daisy began to miss Ethan and the way her life used to be, she would think about Carlos and remember that she still had Cody and that she would see Ethan again. Even with him gone, she had more than some people. "That's a wonderful perspective, Carlos. I'll let you get back to work, but let me know if you need anything else." Carlos tipped his wide-brimmed hat. "I will. Thank you, Miss Daisy." As he returned to his work, Daisy remounted her mare and continued her tour of the perimeter. Carlos's words rang in her head. She was glad for all that God had given her. She'd had a wonderful 10-year marriage with Ethan. She had a handsome son because of that marriage, and Fanny was a blessing. She should be thanking her lucky stars and trusting God to provide for tomorrow. But that was so much harder now that she held the fate of people's jobs in her hands. If only she could find a way to keep it all going. Chapter 3. Hunter. Hunter's jaw dropped as he passed the city limit sign for Soda Spurs. This was it? This was where his father had wanted to build a dude ranch? Why? There was nothing here. Okay, there was a town, if you could call it that, but it left a lot to be desired. No building was higher than 3 stories, and few trees dotted the landscape. He passed one grocery store, a general store, and a post office. No coffee joints, no gyms, no malls. What would people even do in this town? He supposed if they were coming to a dude ranch, it was more to get away from the city than for the comforts the city offered, and they would certainly get that here. He would be hard-pressed to find any of the comforts he was used to. As the buildings turned into homes, he realized he had passed out of the main downtown area and into the residential area without even seeing a hotel. He should have asked Goldman where he was supposed to stay. There had been a hotel in the last city, but that was nearly an hour behind him. Would he really have to make that drive every day? And what on earth was he supposed to do in this town all day while he looked for Daisy Keller? He needed a story, something he could tell the townspeople that gave him a reason to be looking for Daisy. But what? He certainly couldn't come out and say he was here to buy her land. As he turned the car around and headed back toward the main part of town, he passed a building with a small sign that read Soda Spurs Gazette, and inspiration struck. That was it. He could pretend to be a reporter of some kind, doing a story on small-town life. Interviewing a ranch owner would certainly make sense in a situation like that. Now, if he could just find a place to stay. Surely there was some hotel, or inn, or bed and breakfast around here. As he turned down one of the side streets, a wooden sign that said Soda Spurs Inn caught his attention. He glanced at the house behind it. Though not as big as he was used to, the house appeared to be in decent condition, and at least it would mean he wouldn't have to drive back and forth every day. Assuming they had vacancies. Of course, he couldn't fathom there was ever a day they were full. Parking in the small driveway, he turned off the engine of the truck he'd borrowed from the company after Goldman had insisted his Ferrari would be too flashy, and walked up the crunchy gravel to the porch. The house was a 2-story ranch-style home, painted a creamy yellow color with brown trimmings that Hunter associated more with a cake than a house. A bell above the door announced his arrival, and a woman with short curly brown hair and black cat-eye glasses looked up from the desk. "Welcome to the Soda Spurs Inn. Can I help you?" Though her smile was wide, the slight lifting of her brows along with it led him to believe it was more out of flirtation than recognition. Relief flooded him that she didn't appear to know who he was. As a real estate mogul, he didn't grace the news or magazines as often as actors or athletes, but he had been on a few covers when they profiled young single billionaires. Altering his voice slightly, he jumped into the cover story he had devised on his drive down here. "Yes, I was hoping to rent a room for a few days, maybe a week." He wasn't sure how long it might take to convince Daisy to sell, but he couldn't imagine he would need more than a week. "You're in luck," the woman said, as she clicked a few buttons on the computer next to her. "The 4th of July festival is in a few days, and we are normally booked solid, but I just had a cancellation. Are you here for the festival?" Booked solid? How many rooms did this place have, and what was so amazing about this festival? "I wasn't, but that sounds like fun. Perhaps I'll have to extend my stay." He flashed his most charming smile and watched the woman melt underneath it. A sigh spilled from her lips as she rested her chin on her hand. "You should. It's a ton of fun, and I'd be happy to accompany you to any festivities if you stayed." "I'll definitely keep it in mind." He flashed her a quick wink for good measure. "I'm actually here to do a story on small-town life. I'd love to get your input on running an inn in a small town, since your place here seems so nice." A fierce pink spread across her cheeks just as he'd expected it would. "It's really more of a bed and breakfast than an inn, due to the personal attention I give each guest." She batted her eyes at him slightly. "But that was a little long to put on a sign, so I went with inn." Hunter nodded, as if he understood, though in reality he couldn't care less. No matter what personal attention she offered, he doubted this place was up to his usual standards. "I bet my readers would still love it. Mrs." He drew out the last word to emphasize the point she hadn't given her name yet. "Sanders," she said with a smile, "but it's Miss, and you can call me Dixie." "Sounds good, Dixie. So, that room?" "Oh, yes." She turned back to her computer and began tapping the keys. A moment later, a printer whirred to life from underneath the desk, and she placed a paper on the counter for him to scan. "There's a menu with the options we offer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner each day in your room. Checkout is by 11 a.m. of the day you want to leave, and quiet hours begin at 9:30 p.m. Hunter paused his perusal of the contract to lift a brow at her. Quiet hours? Dixie shrugged and offered an embarrassed smile. "The town pretty much shuts down at 9, and we have a few older folks who stay here, as well as the neighbors, so it works out for everyone." "I see." As Hunter scribbled a fake name across the signature bar, he began revising the plan he'd devised. He would need to speed up his timeline before he lost his mind in this small town. "Okay, I have you in room 2. It's just up the stairs, but I can take you there if you'd like." Dixie's smile reminded him of an eager puppy greeting an owner who'd been out all day as she held out the key and stared up at him. "I think I'll be okay," Hunter said, taking the key from her. Disappointment colored her features as the corners of her smile fell, and Hunter hurriedly spoke again to re-engage her. "But I do have one more question that I'm hoping you can answer. I was hoping to do a story on a rancher or a farmer as well. Do you know who would be best to talk to?" "Well, there's the Roper and Morrison ranches on the east side of town. I think there might be a few more, but I'm not sure of their names. There used to be more on the west side, but I've heard that many have sold to some company. However, I think the Keller ranch is still out there, maybe a few others." Keller. That was exactly the name he was looking for. Obtaining her location was going to be easier than he thought. "Wonderful. Can you give me an address or a road name?" As if pleased to be helpful again, her face lit up once more. "Sure, I'll print you out a map and have it here for you when you're ready." "Thank you." Hunter flashed Dixie another wink before heading up the stairs she had pointed to earlier. The walls of the upstairs looked much like the ones he had seen downstairs, an eclectic mix of landscape paintings ranging from beaches to mountains to deserts. He wasn't sure if Dixie had decorated the inn herself, but whoever had definitely lacked the design eye. The place was neat and well cared for, but he wouldn't call it stylish. That opinion deepened as he inserted the key into the handle of room 2 and pushed the door open. Painted a simple tan color, the walls themselves weren't offensive, but the desert-themed bedspread combined with the matching pictures on the wall sent Hunter's stomach churning. He could not imagine spending one night here, much less 7. This property had better be worth it. Chapter 4. Daisy. Daisy sighed as she sifted through the mail and saw another letter from Garrison and Sons. The firm's first offer had come about a month ago, and after quickly scanning it, Daisy had tossed it in the trash. It hadn't even been a starting point, and she'd had no desire to sell anyway. The next offer had come roughly a week later. They'd upped their offer, but it still wasn't enough for Daisy. It had, however, been enough for Ethel Grimrose, who'd owned the land next door. Though Daisy hadn't wanted her to sell, she couldn't fault the woman. She was older, in her early 60s, and she'd been working the farm mostly by herself since her husband had passed. Daisy had known the woman's heart was no longer in it, but she had hoped she would have the money to buy Ethel's land before she threw in the towel. Evidently, the owner of the land on the other side of Daisy had also sold, which left her in the unenviable position of being the problem holdout. With trembling fingers, she tore open the envelope and unfolded the paper. Daisy wasn't surprised to see they'd upped their offer. Without her land, the company would have a hard time doing whatever they planned. Still, she didn't know if it was enough. She told herself she wouldn't consider it no matter what, but the offer was decent. With it, she'd be able to purchase a smaller house for herself, Cody, and Fanny, and give the men a sizable severance pay. But then what? She had no idea what she would do next, and she knew the severance pay wouldn't be enough for Carlos to bring his family here.
"What are you doing, Daisy? It's after 9.
Fanny stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her hair already up in curlers, and her frayed and well-loved robe belted around her waist.
"Just thinking."
Daisy pushed the paper toward her aunt. She hadn't told Fanny about the offer yet, but if she was considering taking it, then Fanny deserved to know. Fanny sat down across from her and picked up the paper. Her eyes widened slightly as she read it.
"What is this?"
"An offer to buy the ranch," Daisy said, matter-of-factly. She'd thought that was obvious from the wording.
"I know that, but why do you have it? Why didn't you tear it up as soon as it came?"
"I wanted to, but the truth is, Aunt Fanny, that money is tight. Ethan took out a few loans the year he died, and though his insurance paid them off, there wasn't much left. I've managed to save some by letting a few of the men go, but we need to start bringing money in. The fence repairs and the recent drought hurt us."
"Then we figure it out together."
Fanny folded the paper and slid it back across the table.
"We don't give up, and we don't sell. This is our home, Cody's home. I don't think another big transition like moving would be good for him."
Daisy sighed again. She had wrestled with the same thought. On one hand, a new home that didn't have memories of his father might be good for Cody. But Daisy worried a move would have the opposite effect and send him deeper into his depression. "I know, and I'm open to ideas, but I'm fresh out. I can't get another job, and I don't have time for anything on the side." Fanny stood and walked to the stove.
"What if we rented a few of the rooms?"
she asked as she placed the kettle on and turned the burner up. Why would anyone want to rent a room here? Daisy asked. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Fanny shook her head as she grabbed 2 tea bags from the pantry and then 2 mugs from the cupboard above. You're thinking too small. What's the best part about living out here? Daisy didn't have to think long on that answer. It was the first thing she'd fallen in love with when she visited from the city, and the first thing she'd made sure to do when she moved here. Seeing the stars at night? Exactly. Fanny pointed a finger at her. So, we sell it as a getaway from city life. A place to relax, recharge, and see the stars. I can teach people how to cook and crochet. You can show them ranch life if they're interested. It's more than a getaway, it's an experience. Plus, maybe we'll get lucky and they'll have kids for Cody to play with. The idea did sound intriguing, and if it worked, it would be a way to bring in some extra income without a lot of extra work, but there's already an inn in town, Aunt Fanny. I'd hate to take business away from Dixie. Psh! Fanny waved her hand in a dismissive gesture. First of all, we're offering something she can't. Second, there have been many times that the inn has filled up, and I took people in my old house. The 4th of July festival is this weekend, and I'll bet she's already booked. We could take the overflow. Daisy had forgotten that. Fanny had almost been running a bed and breakfast out of her home with as many times as she'd taken extra visitors in, so this wouldn't be much of a stretch for her. And Fanny was right. The ranch offered something different from the inn in town. Perhaps there could be enough business for both of them. It wouldn't even have to be much, just enough to get through until she could sell the calves. That might work, but how do we go about letting people know? I'm no expert in marketing. You leave that to me, Fanny said as the kettle began to whistle. She shut off the burner and poured water into each mug before bringing them to the table. I'm well enough known in town that I can make sure the word gets out. And I know Sam has started marketing her business. Maybe she and Brent can help us out. Sam was the town mechanic and auto shop teacher who had married a billionaire actor turned novelist who'd gotten stranded in town, and Fanny had played a hand in getting them together. That didn't surprise Daisy, as Fanny had a reputation for getting couples together. She'd even hinted that Daisy should step back into the dating arena. Unfortunately, Soda Spurs did not boast a large population of single men, and the few it did hadn't managed to garner Daisy's interest. Okay, Aunt Fanny, we'll see if your plan works. Though Daisy wanted nothing more than for her aunt's idea to work, she also needed to think of other ways to bring money to the ranch. Perhaps she could increase the egg production or find a few new buyers. Her mind played through the possibilities as she finished her tea. Chapter 5. Hunter. After a quick breakfast and perusal of the map Dixie had left, Hunter headed toward Daisy's ranch. Though flat, he supposed he could see the beauty of the area as the sky filled with pinks and oranges. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a sunrise, and while it wasn't necessarily a place he would want to go to relax, he could understand why some people would enjoy it. The truck bumped over the uneven ground as he turned down the road toward Daisy's ranch. He wasn't exactly sure which one it was, since addresses were harder to see out here, but he was pretty sure the movement and lack of a sold sign out front would point him to the right place. Sure enough, about a mile down the road, he saw a ranch with no sign outside. He could see cows grazing in the fields and hear the cacophonous sounds of chickens and pigs. Turning into the long driveway, he practiced his story again. He didn't know Daisy, but somehow he doubted just showing up and telling her who he was and why they wanted her land would go over well with her. So he'd invented a cover story. It was flimsy, but hopefully she would buy it. Though older, her ranch appeared to be in good condition, and he tried to picture a dude ranch filling the area as he approached her front door. Other than horses, he wasn't sure how a dude ranch was different from the current ranch. He knocked on the door and waited. The seconds ticked by, and he was about to raise his hand again when the door swung open. Hunter's mouth dropped open in surprise. He hadn't seen a picture of Daisy, but from Goldman's insinuation that flirting with her would help, Hunter had assumed she would be close to his age. Instead, the woman staring back at him had white hair and more wrinkles than he could count.
"Yes?"
she asked in a stern voice.
"What do you want?"
"Are you Daisy Keller?" Hunter could hear the hesitation and confusion in his voice, and he swallowed to squelch it.
"Gracious sakes, no!"
The woman let out a sound that was either a deep laugh or a snort.
"I'm her aunt."
Her eyes narrowed and scanned Hunter from head to toe.
"Who are you, and what do you want with her?"
This woman might be small, but there was a fierceness that exuded from every inch of her body. Hunter had no doubt she had been a woman few would tangle with in her youth. "My name is Hunter Goldsby." He'd decided to keep his first name because it would be much harder to remember to respond to another name. The best way to lie was to do as little as possible. "I'm doing a story on small-town life and was hoping to interview a rancher. Dixie, over at the inn, suggested I speak with Daisy." Dixie had actually given him several names, and Daisy's had been near the bottom, but Hunter kept that fact to himself.
"Oh, she did she?"
There was a suspicion in her voice, but Hunter was unsure if it was due to him or Dixie's name.
"Well, Daisy is out back taking care of the animals. I don't know that she'll have time to talk to you, but I'll take you there and let her decide. Follow me."
Hunter moved to step into the house and found himself colliding with the woman's hand, which was surprisingly strong.
"Not through the house."
She looked at him as if he had lost what little sense she expected he had.
"Strangers don't go through the house. They go around the house."
Right. He'd always heard that small-town folk were trusting, keeping their doors unlocked and such, but perhaps that didn't apply when strangers were involved. He followed her around the side of the house, surprised at how spry she seemed. For someone clearly getting along in her age, she didn't seem to be letting it get the best of her. As they rounded the back corner, the sounds of the animals grew louder, and then a female voice filled the air.
"Hold your horses. The food is coming."
When she came into view, Hunter's heart skipped slightly in his chest. Her long blonde hair was tied in a low ponytail, but wisps of it lifted and danced in the breeze. A tan cowboy hat sat low on her head, covering her eyes, but he could see the point of her chin and the slender neck that protruded beneath it. A red and white flannel shirt graced her petite shoulders and narrowed to a set of slim hips, clad in a pair of form-fitting denim jeans. Confidence oozed from the way she carried herself. A boy with blonde hair stood at her side, though he looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else.
"Daisy, you got a second?"
The woman hollered as they neared. Daisy? An interesting name, but as she turned to face them, Hunter found it appropriate. Her face reminded him of a flower. Little to no makeup adorned her face, but she didn't need it. Soft pink lips and eyes the color of a sapphire held his attention.
"What is it, Aunt Fanny?" "This is Hunter Goldsby. He's doing a story on small-town life and was hoping to interview you about owning a ranch."
Daisy barely afforded him a glance before she shook her head. "I don't have time to give an interview. Try the Roper or Morrison Ranch on the other side of town. They might have time for you." The boy, however, stared at him with wide blue eyes.
"Are you from the city?"
Hunter blinked at the boy, unsure if he should answer him or ignore him. Children were not his specialty, but he dated a few women who had children from previous relationships. He'd been able to charm them just as well as the women. He turned on his smile and held his hand out to the boy. "That's right. I'm from Dallas. Have you ever been there?" The boy's mouth turned down.
No, I've never been anywhere but here. Mom says maybe we'll go someday if we get the...
"Cody, that's enough," Daisy said, cutting him off. Whatever her son had been about to say, she clearly didn't want him to hear. "I'm sorry you came out here for nothing, Mr. Goldby, but we have work to do." "It's Goldsby," he said, wondering if she had messed up his name on purpose. "And there's financial compensation for you in it." He wasn't sure if that was the right thing to say to her, but he figured it was worth a shot after the way she stopped her son from sharing. She paused, then slowly turned back to him. "How much?" Hunter thought quickly. How much would be enough to make it worth her while, but not seem outlandish? How much would get her to agree, but not put her in a position to make his job harder? He honestly had no idea. $1,000.
$1,000?
The boy's eyes grew even wider as he looked from Hunter to his mother and back again. Daisy narrowed her eyes and walked back to him, her steps purposeful and firm. "You want to pay me $1,000 to sit down with you for a few minutes and discuss life on a ranch?" Crud. He could tell from the incredulous tone of her voice that he had clearly overshot his target. So he said the first thing that came to mind. "No, but I'll pay you $1,000 to take me through life on the ranch. Teach me what you do." She tilted her head at him as her eyes scanned him from head to toe. Finally, her eyebrow lifted. "You want to do what I do." Yikes. What had he gotten himself into? He didn't want to do what she did. He had no desire to get his hands dirty. Not at all. But he was kind of stuck now. If he backed out, she would suspect him, if she didn't already. "Yes, consider me a method actor. What better way to be able to write about it than by doing it?" He waited as she considered his offer. "I'll tell you what, you make it $2,500, and I'll let you shadow me for 1 whole week. I'll teach you what I know and let you get your hands dirty. If you don't have the time or the money, then I don't either." Hunter swallowed. $2,500 was a drop in the bucket, but working with her for a week, doing what she did, that looked like more torture than any bill could ever be. Even staying in this town that long seemed like torture. Still, what choice did he have? "Deal." "Good. You can start today. I'll teach you how to feed the chickens. I was teaching Cody here anyway."
"I'll let you 3 finish then,"
the elderly woman said. Though Hunter wasn't sure, he thought he caught a hint of humor in her voice and a tiny smile on her lips before she turned and walked into the house. Daisy walked back toward the chicken coop. "So, this is a chicken coop." She pointed to the large wired contraption that resembled a jail cell. In it, Hunter could see 10 to 12 chickens tilting their heads and staring at him. He wasn't sure he'd ever seen a grown chicken in real life, and they were slightly terrifying. Most of them had large red combs and some red dangly bit underneath their beak, but it was their feet that bothered him the most. Long and scaly, they looked more like the claws of velociraptors from Jurassic Park than peaceful barnyard animals. "I know what a coop is," Hunter said, with a hint of derision. He might not have seen one in person, but the contraption could clearly be nothing else. Daisy shrugged. "Just making sure. I know city dwellers rarely have time to learn about chickens." He turned to regard her. "That seems to be a hasty generalization. What would you know about city dwellers?" The teasing smile slid from her face. "More than you'd think." Her words were soft, but heavy with emotion. "Anyway, chickens are fairly easy to take care of. I check their food and water each day, grab any eggs they've laid, and let them have some free range time. Cody will be taking that part over soon." "Aw, man," Cody said, kicking at the ground with his shoes. Ignoring him, Daisy continued. Once a week or so, I move the coop and clean it out. Her eyes roamed his outfit, Gucci jeans, a designer shirt, and his loafers. I had planned to do that today, but as you're clearly not dressed for it, I'll save that for tomorrow. You might want to wear something you don't mind getting dirty when you come tomorrow. Hunter hadn't brought anything like that, as getting his hands dirty hadn't been in the plan, but he assumed the town had a store where he could pick something up. Fair enough. Daisy issued a swift nod. Okay, well, let's move. The first thing you need to do is open the coop to get the containers.
I can do it,
Cody said, stepping toward the door. Daisy caught him by the shoulders and held him in place. I know you can do it. Let's see if Mr. Goldsby can. Her insinuation of his incompetence bugged Hunter, and he stepped toward her, determined to prove her wrong. As he peered into the coop, an unpleasant odor assaulted him. Though not the same smell as manure, it certainly wasn't a smell he would enjoy filling his nose every day. The chickens fluttered and clucked at him as he peered into their home, and he resisted the urge to jump back. Somehow, the very way they moved was so strange and unnatural. His eyes flicked away from the birds and to the cage itself. Small silver latches dotted the outside of the cage, appearing to hold different doors closed. He reached for the first clasp and tried to ignore the trepidation that passed through him as the chickens made strange noises and tilted their heads at him. It was a small door, but he had not counted on how fast chickens were. Within seconds of the door opening, they rushed at him in a clucking cacophony of feathers, flapping wings, and beaks. A sound, way too close to a scream, escaped his lips as he fell backward onto the ground. He watched in dismay as chickens fluttered past him, and that dismay grew when he lifted his hand to reveal a slimy white smear across his palm. Though he couldn't be certain, he had a strong hunch he'd just stuck his hand in chicken poop. His stomach bunched in disgust as he wiped his hand in the grass. "You fell in poop," the boy said, before his laughter overtook him. Hunter looked up to see Cody bent over and shaking with laughter. Daisy was a little more composed, but the fist against her mouth, combined with the slight shaking of her shoulders, let him know she was laughing at him too. "You sure you still want to do this story? My life is definitely not glamorous." A part of Hunter wanted to throw in the towel, to tell her who he was and just offer her more money. He didn't enjoy being laughed at. But another, more primal part of him wanted to prove that he could do this. He wanted to prove it to her, but perhaps even more, he wanted to prove it to himself. Dusting off his backside, he stood and pulled his shoulders back. "I can do this." He turned his attention to the boy. "A little poop never hurt anyone, am I right?" The boy giggled and shook his head. Daisy's laughter subsided. "Okay, I usually feed them while they have free range time." Hunter glanced around, but he didn't see anything that looked like food for a chicken. What did they even eat? "And you keep that where?" She was obviously having a little fun toying with him. "In the barn." She nodded to the large red structure behind them. "Let's go." The dense darkness of the barn surrounded him as Daisy opened the door, and even though it was still early, heat rolled over him like an oppressive blanket. Daisy reached down and placed a large rock in front of the open door. Though it allowed light to enter, it wasn't much, and Hunter still found himself blinking as he tried to adjust to the dimness of the barn.
"I'll have to go in here by myself every day?"
Cody asked, fear filling his voice. "Don't worry, there's nothing to be afraid of in the barn," Daisy said, as she placed a hand on his shoulder. Hunter felt sorry for the kid. He'd been afraid of the dark when he was young too, so he knew exactly how he felt. "Besides, Cody, I think I'll be doing this for the next week with you." The boy shot him a grateful look, sucked in a big breath, and nodded. Daisy led the way toward a back wall, and Hunter followed, breathing shallow breaths to keep from inhaling the ripe smell of manure. He wondered if cleaning up in here would be part of his crash course, or if she would spare him. Somehow, he doubted it. When they reached the back, Daisy stepped aside, and Hunter glanced down at the 4 bags stacked against the wall. All were white, but none sported a label. How on earth was he supposed to know which bag was for the chickens? "Which one is it?" "Sometimes the bags will come labeled, but the supplier I buy from saves money by not using a logo. That means you either mark them when they come in, or you learn to distinguish the food quickly. A pig might eat chicken feed, but chickens won't eat pig feed." She pointed to the smallest bag. "I like to stay organized, so I arrange the bags according to the size of the animals. Chickens, pigs, goats, horses." "Makes sense." Daisy nodded. "You'll find on a farm or ranch you want to simplify life. There are not enough hours in the day to spend it hunting down things or having to distinguish between them. Grab the bag and we'll get the chickens fed." Hunter lifted the bag and followed Daisy back, but her words bounced around in his head. Did she work all day? And if so, did she expect him to? What exactly had he gotten himself into? Chapter 6. Daisy. As Daisy watched Hunter work, she wondered what his angle was. He'd said he was from the city, which was obvious from the way he was dressed, but she wasn't sure he was really a reporter. Not that she'd met many, but she had expected him to take notes or snap pictures or something. If he were really writing a story, wouldn't he do that? Perhaps this was part of his method acting, but she wasn't sure. A niggling at the back of her mind wondered if he could be from the company trying to buy her farm. But then why pretend to be doing a story? Why not just show up and offer her more money or try to sweet-talk her? Hunter was a good-looking man with his dark brown hair and soulful brown eyes. Not that she was looking for a relationship. Though she didn't want to remain alone for the rest of her life, she wasn't sure she was ready to try again yet. Nor would Hunter be staying. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. "What's next?" Hunter asked. His shoulders were not nearly as rigid now as they had been when he'd first arrived, and the exhaustion bled through his voice. It wasn't surprising, as she'd taken him through feeding the pigs, goats, and horses after the chickens. Even Cody, who'd mainly just been watching, looked exhausted. "Now we eat lunch." The sun was high overhead, and the rumblings of hunger had already begun in Daisy's stomach. She had no idea if Hunter had eaten, but he was bound to be famished either way. "Oh, I don't want to intrude on your lunch. Should I come back later, or just tomorrow?" The hint of hopefulness in his voice did not go unnoticed, but Daisy wasn't letting him off that easy. "Nonsense. Aunt Fanny always makes plenty of food, and I'm sure she already has a plate for you. Yesterday, she made like 100 pancakes for just the 3 of us," Cody piped up. The mention of food seemed to invigorate his spirit again. Hunter opened his mouth to protest further, but after a moment he closed it and nodded. "Okay, lunch sounds good then. My stomach has been informing me of its displeasure for a while now." Daisy led the way into the house and pointed out the bathroom for him so he could clean up. His clothes were going to need a good washing tonight, but she had nothing for him to change into here, so she wasn't offering that service up. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Hunter appeared to be about the same size Ethan was, and there were a few of his clothes still packed in a box under her bed, but they were going to remain exactly where they were. "I assume Mr. Goldsby is joining us for lunch?" Fanny asked, as she set 4 plates down on the table. "I figured you already had food for him," Daisy said, as she washed her own hands in the kitchen sink. "Of course I did. It is rude to eat in front of people without feeding them, and I assumed you weren't letting him off with a half day of work. Fanny smiled up at Daisy as she grabbed 4 cups from the counter. Daisy shook her head and dried off her hands. Definitely not. She turned her attention to Cody for a minute. Cody, be sure to wash your hands too. But, Mom, I didn't do anything. That doesn't matter. You always wash your hands before you eat. Daisy turned her attention back to Fanny. Did you find anything else out about our guest? Fanny tilted her head and blinked. Was I supposed to be looking? A small sigh billowed from Daisy's lips. Maybe not. I just wonder if he's who he says he is. A part of me thinks he's not really a writer. Fanny pursed her lips for a moment. Well, whoever he is, God sent him here for a reason. We will be friendly until we have a reason not to. Daisy nodded. She wished she had the faith of her aunt. Fanny firmly believed that everything happened for a reason, and she seemed to trust with an unwavering faith that God was always in control. Daisy was a believer, but she wasn't sure if she bought that God had a purpose for everything. Was there really a purpose if she tripped feeding the chickens one day and skinned up her knees? I like him, Cody spoke up as he turned off the water and dried his hands. He's funny. Daisy wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, she liked that Cody was smiling for the first time in a while, but what would happen when Hunter left? Would he sink even lower? Before she could say anything further, Hunter rejoined them. He'd washed the dirt from his hands and face, but Daisy thought that both were a little pinker than they had been this morning. She'd have to remember to offer him a hat or sunscreen after lunch. Something sure smells good, Hunter said with an appreciative smile. That would be my meatballs. Fanny returned with a smug grin. I start them simmering in the morning, and by lunchtime they are full of flavor. You can eat them alone, or, if you prefer, I've cut up some bread for meatball sandwiches. Take a seat. She indicated to the table to let him know that he could choose his chair first. When they were all seated, Hunter reached for his bread, but, true to form, Fanny smacked his hand before he could touch his food. I don't know about you, but we pray here before we eat. Don't worry, I get smacked at least once a week, Cody said with a smile. Hunter glanced at Daisy as if to see if Fanny was serious. Daisy mashed her lips together to fight a smile. She, too, had earned a few smacks over the years. Oh, all right then. Hunter closed his eyes, and Cody and Daisy followed suit. Fanny said a quick grace, and then they dove into the delicious fare. I can't remember the last time I had a lunch that good, Hunter said, as he pushed his plate forward and leaned back. Do you eat like this every day? Daisy nodded and smiled at the older woman. Aunt Fanny is an amazing cook, and since she can't do much of the farm work, she makes the meals instead. Hunter looked from one woman to the next. So, you eat every meal together? Of course, Fanny said as her forehead furrowed, and she lifted one brow. Don't you? Hunter shrugged and dropped his gaze to the table. My mom left when I was young, and my dad died a few months ago. It's just been me most nights. Daisy felt her heart tighten, and it ached even more when Cody placed a hand on Hunter's arm and spoke up. I'm sorry. My dad died a year ago, too. It's hard not having a dad. Hunter glanced at Daisy before nodding at Cody. It is. I'm sorry you lost your dad. Me too, Cody said with a sigh. Hunter looked back to Daisy. This was his farm. He said the words as if realizing it rather than asking a question. Daisy nodded. It was. His parents owned it before he did, and their parents before them. This ranch has been in Ethan's family for close to 100 years. I, on the other hand, came from the city, and I thought it had everything until I came out here. But now you know better, Fanny interjected as she placed a hand on Daisy's arm. Daisy returned the smile. Yes, now I know better. She shook her head as memories and regrets surfaced, vying for her attention. Now I just hope I get to stay here. Hunter nodded, but there was something in his expression that sent that niggling thought in her brain strumming again. Did he know something she didn't know? But how could he if he was who he said he was? Fanny patted her hand once more.
God will provide, and even if he doesn't, Ethan will understand.
As if the conversation was over, Fanny picked up the plates and carried them over to the sink.
I'm sure you three have a few more chores to do, so I'll get to washing these dishes. Will you be joining us for supper, Hunter?
I appreciate the offer, but if it's okay with you, I need to stop by the store and see about some new clothes before tomorrow. Plus, these are going to need a good washing.
I'll let you leave early then,
Daisy said, scooting her chair back. The general store closes at 7, and you'll want to make sure you're there before closing time. Hunter's eyes widened. 7? Why so early? Daisy chuckled. You'll find that in a small town, family is important. The owner has kids and wants to be able to eat dinner with them every night, too. It takes a little getting used to, but after a while, you appreciate the time to unwind. Hunter didn't look convinced, but Daisy hadn't been either at first. Once she'd moved here and embraced the small-town life, though, she began to see its charm. She opened the back door and led the way back toward the barn. Though she didn't normally check the perimeter after lunch, it was cool enough today she thought the horses could handle it, and she wanted Hunter to see the employees if possible. He should definitely include stories like Carlos's in his article. Chapter 7. Hunter. Hunter was still so busy processing lunch and the conversations after it that he didn't realize they were back at the barn until Daisy threw open the door. We have more to do in the barn? They'd fed all the animals, so unless they got a second feeding, he feared their return to the barn meant cleaning out the stalls. He wasn't sure exactly what that entailed, but he was sure it would be dirty, and he had hoped she would save that for tomorrow when he had less expensive clothing on. Daisy shook her head. I thought we'd take a break from work for a bit and ride around the property so you could see the whole place and maybe meet the few people who still work here. He blinked at her. People work here? She chuckled. Of course. You didn't think I ran this whole ranch on my own, did you? It's small as ranches in Texas go, but it's still too big for one person. Actually, he hadn't really thought about how the ranch was run. He probably should have, but thinking about people was his least favorite part of this job, so he usually avoided it.
Do I get to go too?
Cody asked. Of course. We'll saddle Sadie for you after I get Hunter set up. Hunter was struck by how much he didn't know about this place. How many people did she employ? And would they be out of work if his company bought the land? He knew people losing their jobs sometimes went with the business, which was why he preferred purchasing empty land or established resorts where most of the staff could stay put. Even when the company had purchased other companies, ones they'd had to restructure in order to turn them profitable, his father had always tried to keep as many of the original employees as he could. Would her people even want to work on a dude ranch, though? And what about Daisy herself? What would she, Cody, and Fanny do? How many people do you employ? He finally asked, knowing that he would have to think through all the questions racing around in his head when he got back to the inn tonight. Daisy's face fell. Just 3 right now. Ethan always had at least 10 on a regular basis, but when he was killed, I had to lay some people off. She shook her head as if trying to clear invisible demons. Thankfully, most of them were able to get another job, but a few had to move out of the area. I felt awful firing them, but I figured keeping a few and trying to build the ranch back up was better than losing it all. Plus, someday I hope to expand. Expand? And do what? She nibbled at her bottom lip as if debating if she wanted to share that secret. I would love to have a horse camp for underprivileged kids. She glanced at Cody and sighed. There isn't much for kids to do in this town, and I'd like to have a place for them to go where they can learn skills and have a little fun. Hunter shifted his attention from her. She was not what he'd expected at all, and his actual purpose no longer seemed as noble as it had when he'd agreed to come here. The question was, what did he do about it? Anyway, she said with a small sigh, as she changed the direction of the conversation, do you know how to ride? Hunter shook his head. He'd never been on a horse, though he had often wondered what riding one would be like. It wasn't that he wanted to be a cowboy permanently, but to see how they lived for a few days had always sounded like an adventure. You've never ridden a horse? Cody asked, clearly shocked by Hunter's admission. Not too many horses where I live, kid. It's not too hard, though, is it? Well, the corners of Daisy's lips twitched as she tilted her head. It depends on the person. I didn't think it was that hard, but I have seen people struggle. I'm sure I'll be fine. Just show me what to do. When he'd said those words, he hadn't thought there would be much to do. But as Daisy went over how to brush and saddle the horse, his eyes began to glaze over. How did she know this much? She'd mentioned growing up in the city, but obviously she had been here long enough to embrace small-town life. He wondered if Goldman had any idea what even went into running a dude ranch. Surely the man simply planned on hiring someone who did. But Hunter was beginning to wonder if they'd bitten off more than they could handle this time. Okay, so now we're ready to mount up. Hunter blinked and brought his focus back to Daisy, who was leading the first horse out of the stall. The animal was much larger than Hunter had expected, and visions of him flying off the back of the horse flashed through his mind. This one? Daisy laughed and touched the horse's nose. Don't worry, this guy is big, but he's an angel. He won't steer you wrong. Let's get you in the saddle. Hunter followed Daisy's directions, but he still felt extremely uncoordinated as he swung up on the horse's back. Hold the reins, Daisy said, placing them in his hands. I'll be right back. Before he could say a word, she had dashed back into the barn. Hunter tried not to panic as he felt the massive creature shift beneath him. He could do this. If Daisy, who was feminine and petite, could control an animal like this, then so could he. Thankfully, the horse did not move from its position until Daisy and Cody reappeared, each on top of their own horse. Cody's horse was much smaller than Daisy's, or the one he was on, but he still looked confident and at home on the back of the animal, as did Daisy. Hunter had thought Daisy was pretty before, but there was something about seeing her command the powerful animal that made her even more appealing. Her shoulders were pulled back, making her neck appear even longer and more slender. The wind lifted her long blonde hair from her neck and back, fluttering it in the breeze like the tail of a kite in the summer sky. And even her face seemed brighter, more animated, as if this was her happy place. A heavy feeling sprouted in his stomach once again. He didn't know this woman, not really. So why did he feel so guilty at the thought of buying her land and putting her out of business? Ready? Swallowing his traitorous thoughts, he nodded. She gave him a quick tutorial in how to hold the reins, how to make the horse move, and most importantly, how to make it stop. Then she proceeded to lead the way to the fence. Though he would never have considered it beautiful before, there was something breathtaking in the flat Texas landscape. Not only did the air feel cleaner, but he felt like he could see for miles. That was something he never got in the city. Well, he could see for miles from the windows in his office, but that was only due to the fact that it was so many floors up. In reality, there were plenty of times he almost felt claustrophobic on the city streets, with the large buildings looming over him and the people pressing against him as he walked the crowded sidewalks? Perhaps that was why he enjoyed his office so much. It was the one place he felt as if he could breathe. They rode in silence around the majority of the property, but as they neared the back part, Hunter could see a few men working on a section of fence. Daisy reined in her horse to fall into step beside his. "Those are my employees, the few that are left." She lifted her hand and pointed at the man closest to the fence. "That's Carlos. He immigrated here from Mexico, and now he's working to try and bring his family here." Her finger moved slightly to the left. "And that's Frank. He lost his wife and baby daughter in childbirth 2 years ago. He was suicidal before Ethan hired him and helped him find a new purpose. The young one there is Jorge. He just graduated, and he wants to go to college, but he has no money, so he's working here to save up. He'll be the first in his family to attend." With each name, the heavy feeling in Hunter's stomach grew even larger. He'd rarely thought about the people who worked at places he bought, but these men all had families to take care of too, or other reasons that kept them here. Would the company keep them on at the Dude Ranch? Would they even want to work there? "They seem like good men." Daisy smiled and nodded. "They are. The best. I don't know what they'll do if I can't make this ranch work and I have to sell it." She sighed and added in a softer voice, "I don't know what I'll do either." The moment hung in the air between them, and Hunter wanted to speak up, to tell her who he was, but he couldn't. Not yet. Not until he decided what to do. "Anyway, we should probably get back. I know you wanted to stop at the general store, and I've got more work to do." Hunter nodded, though a tiny shred of disappointment pierced him. He was exhausted, and he did need to stop at the store as well as take a shower. So why was he disappointed that he was getting off the hook early? Could it have something to do with the beautiful blonde woman to his right, or the boy that reminded him so much of himself after his mother had left? No, certainly not. After all, he had Brittany back home, and while he was fairly certain she was not the woman he would one day marry, Daisy was not the kind of woman he was interested in. Was she? "Yeah, sounds good. I'll rest tonight and be ready for another day tomorrow." Hopefully, the rest and time away from her would also clear his head and refocus his purpose. He was here to do a job, get her to sell, one way or the other, so he could get back to his job and his life. Chapter 8. Daisy. Daisy glanced up at the knock on the barn door and sighed when she saw Sheriff Gillespie. Though kind, he was too cowboy for Daisy. The man embodied the stereotype to a T, from his 10-gallon hat to the spurs on his boots. Daisy hadn't even known people could still buy spurs, but he had found a way. Unfortunately, he had also made it his mission to try and date her a few months ago. Evidently, he felt that a woman shouldn't be on a ranch alone, and that a boy needed a father figure in his life. While she agreed with the latter, she had no desire to marry or even date the sheriff just to have a man in Cody's life. She plastered a fake smile on her face as she greeted him, and wished she hadn't let Cody off the hook so soon. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" He hooked his thumbs in his belt loops and grinned at her. "I was just doing my rounds and thought I would check on you and Cody and Fanny. It must be getting lonely out here with all the other farms selling." It had felt lonelier. Not only did Daisy miss having neighbors, but she missed hearing their animals, and she missed Fanny having someone to talk to during the day while Daisy worked. Her aunt hid it well, but she could tell the woman missed talking with Ethel each day. Hopefully, her bed and breakfast idea would gather steam and people would start coming. Not only would that help financially, but it would give Fanny something to do as well. Something other than dealing with Cody and his moodiness. "It's definitely quieter, but we're making it." "That's good to hear." He nodded and pressed his lips together as if he wanted to say more, but wasn't sure where to start. I know you're busy and all, being short-handed, but I wanted to see if you might like to join me for dinner. And there it was, the offer he made every time he stopped by. One would think he would get the hint after the first few times Daisy turned him down, but the man had a stubborn streak a mile long. Thank you for the offer, but I have someone coming in the morning to learn about ranch life, and I really need to get some work finished before he comes. Suddenly the thumbs slipped from the loops, and Sheriff Gillespie stood a little taller. Oh yeah? He's doing a story or looking for a job? A story. Fanny said his name was Hunter Goldsby, but I didn't get much beyond that. I see. Well, I hope for your sake he's on the up and up, but you know you can call me if you ever need anything, right? Daisy could hear the hope in his voice, but she knew she would have to be in real trouble before she would call the sheriff. Perhaps if they did get people staying with them, Fanny could find a woman who would be a perfect match for Sheriff Gillespie, because a new focus might be the only way to get his fixated gaze off her. Thank you, Sheriff. I'll keep that in mind, but really, he seems harmless. He was here most of the day today, and nothing happened. Daisy saw the look of jealousy flash across the sheriff's face. It was brief, and he recovered quickly, but it had been there. Dwight Gillespie had never caused problems for her before, and she hoped he wouldn't now, especially with everything else on her plate. Daisy wasn't sure she could take one more problem. All right, then, he said, tipping his hat. I'll let you get back to work, but someday I'm going to get you to have that dinner with me. Daisy forced a smile and swallowed her sigh. That was exactly what she was afraid of. At some point, the man would wear her down, but accepting would only lead him on. She'd have to find a solution before that happened. Good night, Sheriff. When she was sure he was actually gone, Daisy made her way back to the house. She was starving and tired, and with another long day looming over her, she needed to get to bed early. Was that Sheriff Gillespie I saw leaving? Fanny asked, as Daisy washed her hands in the sink. Yep, sure was. He was swinging by to check on us and ask me to dinner. Again. She rolled her eyes as she turned off the faucet and grabbed a towel. Maybe you should just go out with him and see, Fanny began, but Daisy cut her off with a shake of her head. Aunt Fanny, we have been through this. I am not interested in dating right now, and certainly not Dwight Gillespie. Fanny's sigh held just the hint of exaggeration. I know, but I worry about you. I had a good long time with my Jack, and I know you loved Ethan, but it's just you and Cody here on this big ranch. It's not just us, Aunt Fanny. We have you. You know what I mean, Fanny said with a slight scowl. I'm getting along in years, and I won't be a good companion forever. Besides, don't you want more children running under your feet one day, tromping muddy prints on your freshly cleaned floors? Daisy chuckled. When you put it like that, I can't believe I haven't had a bushel of kids already. She grabbed the plates from Fanny and carried them to the table. I wouldn't mind more kids one day, Aunt Fanny, but I want them with the right man, especially with everything Cody is going through. I can't just jump into another relationship. It has to be the right one. Speaking of Cody, where is he? He should be here in a second. I told him to wash his hands for dinner. Fanny set a large bowl of spaghetti down in the middle of the table, and then turned back to grab a salad from the big island bar. What about Hunter? She asked when she returned. He seemed nice. Daisy rolled her eyes and shook her head. She knew Fanny meant well, but that was just silly. I don't even know him, Aunt Fanny, and he doesn't live here. There would be no point starting a relationship with a man who lives in Dallas. What magazine does he work for anyway? I don't know. He didn't say. Daisy froze. the fork she intended to place hovering inches from its place as she turned her attention to her aunt. He didn't say? Did you ask? Had Fanny gotten any information about this man she had led all over her ranch? Fanny tilted her head and tapped her chin.
I don't guess I did. He said Dixie gave him your name, so I figured he was okay.
Who's okay? Cody asked as he entered the kitchen. No one, Daisy said. At the same time, Fanny answered,
Hunter.
Cody's face lit up.
I liked him. He was funny, and he didn't get mad when he fell in poop. See, Cody approves,
Fanny said. Daisy rolled her eyes. No offense, but Cody is 8 years old. He's not skilled at judging people's character.
Hey,
Cody said, frowning and folding his arms across his chest. Fanny placed an arm around his shoulders as she led him to a table.
Don't worry, Cody. I think you're a great judge of character.
She turned her attention back to Daisy as she pulled her own chair out.
Besides, I figured any story would be good for business. You got him to pay you, right?
Yes. Daisy swallowed her exasperation as she sat down in her own chair. Fanny had always lived in Soda Spurs, and she didn't know how ruthless the outside world could be. He is paying me, which will help. But Aunt Fanny, what if he writes something terrible about the ranch? That would kill what little business we have.
Why would he do that?
Fanny narrowed her gaze at Daisy.
You were nice to him, weren't you?
Yes, Aunt Fanny. I was nice to him, but what if he works for a company that opposes ranching? Or worse, what if he works for the company trying to buy me out?
Well, you can ask him that tomorrow. Now let's pray so I can eat. My stomach is grumbling, and I'm not getting any younger.
Before Daisy could reply, Fanny had bowed her head, closed her eyes, and begun the prayer. Daisy followed suit, holding her statement until the prayer was finished. Only when Fanny uttered amen did she dare to continue the conversation. Aunt Fanny, I can't just ask that. Fanny scooped a heaping of spaghetti onto her plate.
Why not? He's working here all week, right?
Yes, but I can't just pop a question like that. He'd probably lie anyway. Daisy grabbed the scoop from Fanny and filled her own plate.
Why would he lie?
Cody asked. Fanny shook her head.
He probably wouldn't. Your mother is sometimes too quick to expect the worst from people.
She shot Daisy a pointed stare.
Perhaps he'll surprise you and tell you what you want to know.
Daisy supposed it was possible. Hunter had seemed kind and genuine, but she'd known enough people in her life who seemed kind but were actually ruthless. The phrase, a wolf in sheep's clothing, hadn't been created out of thin air. Still, she supposed it couldn't hurt to ask. Chapter 9. Hunter. Hunter could not believe how tired he was when the alarm went off the next morning. He didn't even think he had done that much work, but his muscles were sure complaining about something. As he shut off the alarm on his phone, it vibrated beneath his fingers with an incoming call. Hunter sighed when he saw Work's number. He had spent hours last night wrestling with what to do, but he'd finally come to the decision that he couldn't take Daisy's land from her. She, her son, and the people she employed needed it. The question was, how was he going to convince Goldman of that? Hello? Hunter, how is it going? Goldman's smooth voice unnerved him even through the phone. It's okay, sir. I spent the day with Daisy Keller yesterday. Good. And did you convince her to sell? Goldman asked, cutting him off. No, sir. In fact, I think we should reconsider. Reconsider? Her property is in the middle of what we want to develop. Why on earth would we reconsider? Because she needs the land. She has a son, and she employs people who rely on this job. Then we'll offer them a new job. Goldman's dismissal was so swift that Hunter wondered if he was even truly listening. I just think we should try to work with Daisy instead of taking her land. I didn't send you there to think. I sent you there to get the job done. So finish the job before I find someone who can."
Hunter opened his mouth to reply, but Goldman had already hung up, and Hunter was left with silence on the other end. He didn't think Goldman could fire him, but he remained in charge of the business and Hunter's monthly draw until the day Hunter met his father's mysterious expectation. And he could certainly make Hunter's life miserable until then. Sighing heavily, Hunter prepared himself for another day of hard work with Daisy. After a quick breakfast, he made his way out to the ranch once again. Unsure if he should walk through the house, he decided to park and go around the side like he had yesterday. He found Daisy and Cody letting the chickens out for their free-range time. She glanced up as he approached. "Oh, good. You're just in time."
"For what?"
She sent him a wicked grin. "Today is cleaning day. I hope those are what you got at the general store." Hunter looked down at the new Levi jeans he had purchased the night before. They were a far cry from his designer pants, but they fit, and they certainly hadn't been expensive. If they got ruined, he wouldn't be concerned, because they wouldn't be returning with him anyway. Neither would the checkered shirt he had purchased.
"They certainly aren't what I wear at my normal job,"
he said, with a half smile. "Speaking of which, what exactly is your normal job?" She threw the question out nonchalantly, and Hunter almost answered truthfully. Thankfully, he caught himself just in time.
"Oh, you know, research and writing."
It wasn't a total lie. He did research a lot of the companies they purchased, and he did write up proposals. But it still felt wrong saying it aloud. Daisy narrowed her gaze at him. "Uh-huh. And where is it exactly that you work?"
"You ever hear of Elite Real Estate?"
he asked, hoping she would say no. Of course, she could still Google the company and find that no Hunter worked for them, but he didn't think she would spend the time. More likely, she was asking now because she realized he hadn't offered the information yesterday. "No, but I don't read a lot of magazines," she said, with a shake of her head. He flashed her a charming smile.
"Me either, but I like that one. So what are we cleaning today?"
he asked, changing the subject and hoping she would let her questions go. "Everything, starting with the coop here." She handed him a rag and pointed to the rails of the coop where poop from the chickens had landed. "Scrub away, and then I'll show you how to clean the bedding. Cody can help you." "Aw, man, this is gonna be even less fun than yesterday," Cody said with a sigh.
"Not if we turn it into a game," Hunter said.
He couldn't imagine having to do farm chores when he was Cody's age, but he'd had chores of his own he hadn't enjoyed. Thankfully, his older sister had been the creative type, and she had invented games and prizes to go along with the chores, making them feel more fun and less like work. "A game?" Cody looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "How do you make a game out of cleaning a chicken coop?"
"Well,"
Hunter tried to think back to things his sister had proposed, but few of them seemed appropriate for this situation. There was one thought that might work. He turned to Daisy.
"Is there an ice cream place in town?"
Daisy tilted her head at him as if trying to figure out his angle. "Yeah, there are a few options. Norma's is a restaurant fairly close that specializes in pies. But I think she has some ice cream options as well. Or there's the soda shop downtown. They do more specialty ice cream and drinks. Why?" Hunter grinned as he looked from Cody to Daisy.
"How about a friendly wager then? We'll both follow your mom's instructions, and whoever cleans the coop the best gets to pick the ice cream we get as a reward."
Cody's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea, but I bet I'm way better at cleaning than you are." "That is a nice idea," Daisy said, "but I'm afraid an ice cream run isn't really in the budget." Cody's shoulders fell, but Hunter was determined to keep a smile on the kid's face.
"It's in my budget, And since I proposed the game, I'm treating."
"That's very kind of you, but we can't accept," Daisy began.
Hunter cut her off before she could finish. "Is this Norma's or the ice cream place a part of small-town life?"
"Yes, I suppose."
"Well, then I have to go there for my story anyway," Hunter continued. He was determined to win this argument. "You aren't really going to make me go alone, are you?"
"We can't let him go alone, Mom," Cody added, joining in the convincing. "No one eats ice cream alone."
Hunter smiled at the kid as Daisy glanced between them. He could see the wheels turning in her head, but there was no reason for her to say no except for pure stubbornness.
"All right," she agreed. "Ice cream it is, but only if I deem your job done well enough."
"Deal," Hunter said with a smile. He and Cody listened intently to Daisy's instructions and then began their work. Scrubbing chicken poop had never been Hunter's idea of fun, but as he and Cody chatted while they worked, he found that he didn't hate it as much as he'd thought. "What grade are you going into this year?" Hunter asked as they finished with the perches and moved to cleaning the bedding.
"Second grade, but I don't really like school."
"Not any of it?" Hunter asked. He knew few kids enjoyed school. He'd been one of those when he was young as well, but school had been a distraction for him after his mother had left. Cody scooped some bedding into a trash bag and looked up at him.
"Well, I like recess."
Hunter laughed. How very like himself Cody sounded. Though he hadn't been around children for a while, Cody appeared to be a pretty cool kid. He glanced up to see Daisy staring at the two of them, but the expression on her face was hard to read. Was she happy? Angry that he was chatting with her son? He might have to ask her soon. After they finished the bedding, Hunter stepped back and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He'd had no idea chickens were so much work. Though he realized how dumb it was now, he'd honestly thought they were kind of like birds. Give them food and water and clean the coop once a week. Of course, he'd only had one bird in his life, a parakeet, when he was a teenager, so his experience on that was limited as well.
"Let's see how you did," Daisy said, stepping forward to examine the coop.
"It better be good enough," Cody said. "I worked hard on it." She made a show of inspecting every minute detail, but Hunter could tell she was impressed.
"I guess ice cream is in order this afternoon."
"Yes!" Cody pumped his fist in the air and executed a silly little dance as Hunter exchanged smiles with Daisy.
Yes, you did a great job, but now we need to move the coop," Daisy said.
"Move it where?" As Hunter looked around, he realized the grass, though short and brown all over, due to the lack of rain, did look different in patches. Some were more green, others more brown and littered with feathers.
"Just a few feet to the side. That way they fertilize different sections of the yard, and they have new grass to eat every few days while they're in the coop."
Hunter was amazed at how the different pieces of the farming worked together. He'd always assumed it was just feeding some animals and planting a few crops, but Daisy was showing him it was much more. More than that, he was beginning to feel a sense of pride when he finished a task. In his life in the city, few of his tasks required much effort, and while he felt satisfaction when he secured a large commission for the firm, it was nothing like this.
"Can I help move the coop?"
Cody asked.
"I'm afraid it's still a little big for you," Daisy said.
When Hunter saw Cody's face fall, he spoke up, hoping he wasn't stepping on Daisy's toes, but anxious to make Cody feel better. He remembered being that age and wanting to be useful, but being told time and again that he couldn't. "Cody, how about you come help me? Your mom seems pretty strong and I don't want to look weak."
"Yeah!"
As Cody fell into place beside him, Hunter glanced at Daisy to see if she was upset, but the look he saw on her face was far from upset. The slight glisten of moisture in her eyes made him think she was grateful, but they also held a bit of fear. What was she afraid of? With a soft sniff, she shook her head, and her voice, though it trembled with emotion, was clear. Okay, on 3, we lift and move to the left. 1, 2, 3. Hunter lifted the coop easily, but made a show as if it were so heavy that only with Cody's help could he really get it off the ground. However, it was heavy enough that he wondered how Daisy managed to move it on her own. Perhaps she had one of the men she employed help her. When they reached the desired location, they set the coop down, and Cody placed his hands on his hips and puffed out his chest.
See, Mom, I can help.
Hunter bit back his laughter as Daisy smiled at the boy.
Yes, you can. I guess that means you're big enough to help muck the stalls, too.
His face fell slightly, but he knew she had him.
Oh, all right,
he said, adding an eye roll for effect.
Thank you for that,
Daisy said quietly, as she fell into step next to Hunter.
He needed that, and I don't think I've been very good at making him feel needed and useful.
No problem. I was about his age when my mom left, and I remember just wishing I could do something to not think about it. Her eyes took on a faraway glaze as she nodded.
I'll have to think about how I can do that more.
Once in the barn, she showed him how to muck the stalls. Cody was in charge of holding the wheelbarrow still, as Hunter picked up the dirty hay. When that job was done, Daisy showed them how to rake through the remaining hay to find any hidden spots. Finally, Cody evened out what was left as Hunter added new hay to the stall. Though it was a workout, and he enjoyed the burn in his shoulders and arms, he would gladly let someone else handle that job if he ever had a ranch. If he had a ranch? Where had that thought come from? He enjoyed his life in the city, didn't he? Can I ask you something? He set his rake against the side of the stall and waited for her to look up. She had let Cody have a break, so it was just the two of them in the stall. She wiped a hand across her forehead and nodded. I guess. What's up? Why did you leave the city? Daisy pressed her lips together, and Hunter wondered if she was even going to answer him.
I guess there were a few reasons. The biggest one, of course, was that I fell in love.
With your husband? She sighed, and a wistful expression covered her face.
I thought I loved the city, the lights, the action, but my college roommate at the time was from a small town. She heard about some apple festival they were doing here and convinced me to come with her. At first, I hated it. I complained the whole first afternoon about how boring it was, how there was nothing to do. But then I saw the sunset, and it took my breath away. You don't see sunsets like that in the city.
Hunter could agree with that. Not only were the sunsets blocked by the tall buildings most of the time, but he couldn't remember the last time he had taken the time to watch one.
The next day, I met Ethan. He took us to his ranch, this ranch, and showed us around. It was pretty much love at first sight. We began dating before I left town, and I found myself returning nearly every weekend to spend time with him and his family. That in itself would be enough for some people, but at the same time I was going through personal hardships in the city, so I took it as a sign that God wanted me to come here.
Hunter mulled over her words for a moment. Questions were racing through his mind, but he wasn't sure which would be appropriate to ask and which would be important to ask. He decided to start with the one resonating loudest in his head. First, I'm sorry about your husband. I've never been married, but I imagine that is a hard loss, especially with Cody. I told you I recently lost my father, but I know it's not the same. I do have to ask, though, how do you know God wanted you to come here? He had known people who claimed to be believers, but he'd never had the courage to ask questions when they spoke of God. However, not knowing Daisy, and knowing he probably wouldn't see her after this week, made it easier to ask her. She tilted her head and studied him.
Do you know God, Hunter?
I don't think so. I guess I believe that someone or something created all of this, but that's about it. Suddenly, he felt a little silly for even having this conversation with her. Well, God doesn't generally speak directly in our ears, but a lot of the time He'll show His plans for us by opening or closing doors. When doors began closing in the city, and my thoughts were constantly returning to Ethan and this place, she indicated the area with her arm. I took that as a sign that God wanted me here. Unfortunately, I'm no longer sure that's His plan, since it appears I'm going to lose this farm before I have a chance to do much with it. Another sigh escaped her lips, and this one seemed to carry the weight of the world. Again, Hunter was hit with the thought that he couldn't let her lose this farm. He would have to find a way to convince Goldman there was another solution. Have you ever considered changing what you do? I mean, instead of just ranching, maybe you could look at adding a dude ranch portion, or more farming? Daisy quirked a brow at him, and the corners of her lips lifted slightly. I'd like to expand to something like that in the future, but I need to get what we currently do working well first. Adding those extras require money I just don't have. I can't just throw up a sign and have a dude ranch. Right. Hunter should have known that, so he didn't know why he felt so crushed. It just seemed like every idea he had was dependent on money, something he had a lot of, but Daisy didn't. Anyway, I'm getting hungry. What do you say we go in and eat? Hunter nodded, but his wheels kept turning. There had to be some way to help Daisy and still give Goldman what he wanted. Chapter 10. Daisy. Daisy couldn't help but admire Hunter's muscles as he stacked the bales of hay. He had taken her advice and picked up clothes from the general store, and while they were not designer labels, they fit him to a T. He looked like a top one like Sheriff Gillespie. Instead, he looked like a rancher, other than the slight highlights in his brown hair that had obviously come from a salon in the city. What? He asked, obviously catching her watching him. Daisy shook her head as a soft heat climbed her cheeks. She was glad she had given Cody the afternoon off. Nothing. I was just noticing that you actually look like you know what you're doing. He lifted an eyebrow. You mean compared to yesterday when I was on my butt covered in chicken poop? She chuckled a little at the memory. Yes, although somehow you even managed to make that look okay. Just okay? His lips twitched. I am seriously losing my touch then. Daisy wondered if he had a girlfriend back in the city. He must. With his good looks and charming personality, it would be hard to believe he didn't. Not that it mattered. She was not looking for a relationship, and at the end of the week, he would be gone anyway. Oh, I'm sure you can find it again when you go back. You probably have dozens of women to practice on. Daisy turned from Hunter's gaze. Why had she said that? It made her sound as if she liked him when she didn't. What about you? Hunter asked, changing the topic from himself. Do you think you'll date again when you have time? Daisy chuckled. In case you haven't noticed, this is a small town, and the selection is sparse. Her smile faded as her eyes dropped to the floor. However, I do know that Cody needs a father figure in his life, so I might date again one day. For him. Fanny and I are great, but we aren't men. However, that will have to wait until I have time and after I get the ranch making money. Daisy tried not to think about her lack of a love life much, but Aunt Fanny had a habit of bringing it to her attention every few days. But wouldn't it be easier with someone else? Daisy's gaze flicked to Hunter, and her voice held a note of defiance as she asked, Are you saying I need a man to make life easier? Hunter's eyes widened as he realized how his words had come out. No, that's not what I meant at all. I just meant with everything here, including the stress of providing for others, wasn't that easier with someone by your side? Her face softened. It was, but I guess it depends on who's by your side. Daisy wanted another partner someday, a companion, but she wanted someone loyal and truthful, not just any man. However, she also wanted to get off this dangerous subject. Anyway, how about we get cleaned up and get that ice cream? I'm sure Cody is ready." Hunter's mouth parted as if he were going to say something else, but instead he nodded. "Do I have time to run back to the inn and change? I'm sure I'm a little sweaty right now." "Actually, that's a good idea. I could use a shower too. How about we pick you up in an hour?" "I'll be ready and waiting." Hunter flashed her a charming smile and a wave before heading out of the barn. Daisy watched him leave and tried to calm the thumping of her heart. She shouldn't be attracted to him. Her head knew that. But her traitorous body was not getting the hint. A shower, that's what she needed. Not only to clean up, but also to cool her body down. 40 minutes later, clean and refreshed, Daisy backed the old SUV out of the driveway and headed toward the center of town, where the inn was located. Cody jabbered behind her, debating with himself what kind of ice cream he was going to get, while Fanny sat silent beside her. Daisy wasn't sure exactly why Fanny had insisted on coming, but she had a sneaking suspicion the woman hoped to entertain Cody and give Daisy and Hunter some time alone. Hunter was waiting for them outside the inn when Daisy pulled up. He had changed into a brown and green plaid shirt, and as he hurried to them, Daisy's pulse quickened once more. "Perfect timing," he said, as he climbed in the back next to Cody. "I have been thinking about chocolate ice cream for the last hour." "Me too," Cody said. "Chocolate is my favorite." "Well, that's because great minds think alike," Hunter said. Daisy could hear the smile in his voice, and a check in the rearview mirror showed his gaze was focused on Cody. Why did he have to be so good with her son? The soda shop was just down the road, and Daisy pulled into the parking lot before Hunter and Cody had even finished their conversation on the best toppings for chocolate ice cream. An old-fashioned shop, the soda shop, looked like it had been preserved from the 50s, complete with a sign shaped like a 1957 Chevy Bel Air. "Whoa, I feel like I've stepped back in time," Hunter said as he opened the door for everyone. The inside of the shop was decorated in a black and white checkered pattern, with pops of blue and pink on the stools that sat around the bar and the booths that lined the walls. An old-fashioned jukebox even croned popular music from the era. "Yeah, the tourists love this place too," Daisy said, leading them to a booth. "It also helps that the food is good too." "Be right there," Erica said from behind the bar as they sat down. Erica had taken over the shop from her parents after earning her business degree at the nearby college. Young and cute, Daisy wondered how long the girl would stay in the small town. It wasn't like men her age were rampant here. "Welcome to the soda shop," she said, handing them each a menu. Her hair was pulled back in a smooth ponytail, and she wore a flouncy striped dress behind a bright pink apron. "Our special today is the chocolate malt. I'll give you a few minutes to look over the menu, but you can holler for me if you decide before I get back." "Thanks, Erica." Daisy glanced down at the menu, but she was certain she knew what she wanted. It was the same thing she ordered every time. A chocolate-covered cherry malt with whipped cream, sprinkles, and a cherry on top. "What's with the flyer?" Hunter asked, pointing to the small piece of paper, decorated with exploding fireworks that had been inserted into a plastic sleeve in the menu. "That's a reminder for the 4th of July carnival Saturday night," Fanny said, as if that were completely obvious. Cody's eyes lit up. "The 4th of July carnival? Is that tomorrow?" "It sure is," Daisy replied, nudging him playfully with her shoulder. Her eyes flicked up to Hunter. "It's a pretty big deal around these parts." "And it would be something worth writing about in your article," Fanny added as she scanned the menu. "Yeah, you should go with us," Cody said. "They have carnival games and music and food, and then they set off fireworks once it gets dark." "Well, when you put it like that, how could I say no?" Hunter asked. "I'd be happy to join you tomorrow, if it's okay with your mother." Daisy's breath caught as he held her gaze. She'd never attended the carnival with a man who wasn't Ethan, and the thought was both exciting and guilt-inducing. However, the puppy dog eyes that Cody shot her direction made up her mind. "Sure, we'll be going anyway. You might as well come with us."
"Good, it's a date,"
Fanny said.
"Now can we order?"
Daisy wanted to protest that it was not a date, but Fanny had already called Erica back over. Surely Hunter would realize it wasn't a date. The ice cream arrived moments later, and the four dug in, enjoying the sugary sweetness. When the bowls were empty and their bellies were full, Hunter paid the bill and led the way back outside.
"Can we walk to the park?"
Cody asked.
"It's still light outside."
"Maybe we should drop Mr. Goldsby off first," Daisy said. "He may not want to go to the park." "Nonsense," Hunter said. "I love parks." "Okay, for a few minutes," Daisy said. She was not surprised when Cody and Fanny took off ahead of them, leaving her alone with Hunter. "What do people do in this town for fun?" he asked as they walked. "I haven't seen much that would qualify as an entertainment venue in this town." Daisy shook her head. "No, I'm afraid there's not much of that. We play movies on a white screen in the gym on the weekends, or in the park during the summer, though they're usually old releases by then. Plus, this town loves its festivals. We have the 4th of July festival coming up that we mentioned earlier. Then there's a cowboy festival a little later in the summer." She began ticking each one off on her fingers. "A fall festival, the Halloween carnival, a Thanksgiving festival, and of course Christmas." Hunter's mouth fell open, and he blinked. "Wow, I attend an annual Christmas party at work, but that's only because it has amazing food."
"What, no Halloween or New Year's parties?"
Daisy asked with a laugh. She'd been out of the city for years, but she knew there were more parties than just Christmas get-togethers. Hunter shrugged. "I guess I've attended a few of those over the years, but nothing like what you're talking about here. That was a lot of festivals you rattled off." Daisy grinned and nodded. "It is, and that's only half the year. But those festivals are about the extent of our entertainment, so I think that's why." "What about you?" Hunter asked. "What do you do for fun?" Daisy's smile faded, and her gaze dropped to the ground. "I don't really have time for fun. I try to take Cody when I can, but the ranch takes up most of my time." "You know, this town is different than I thought it would be," Hunter said. His hands swung lightly at his side, and Daisy wondered what holding his hand would feel like. "What do you mean?" She dragged her attention from his hands, thankful for the distraction. He shrugged. "I've lived in the city my whole life, and I guess I thought small towns were the way you see them portrayed on the TV. Boring and gossipy, but this place feels different." Daisy rolled her eyes as she thought of how fast news traveled in town. Though not as bad as she'd once expected, it hadn't been fun being on the receiving end of that when Ethan died. Everyone had treated her with pity and kid gloves for weeks straight, and her phone had rung with so many calls asking if she and Cody were all right that she'd been forced to leave it off the hook for a few days. "Well, we have our gossipy moments. Frankly, I'm surprised there haven't been more people coming to ask me about you. But for the most part, it's more like a family than a gossip train. As for the boredom, it is different. There aren't any entertainment venues like in the city, but the festivals help. Still, I wish we had more, especially for the kids. Summer is hard when parents have to work, but there isn't much to keep the kids entertained besides the park and the lone movie theater closer to the edge of town that only plays movies from years ago." "What would you like to see?" Hunter asked, catching her eye. Daisy was caught off guard by his interest. "Well, I mentioned the youth camp previously, but I guess I'd love to see some indoor areas for them as well. Maybe a game hall or a skating rink or something along those lines." Hunter nodded, and though she could conjure no reason why he should care, she could swear that he looked as if he was trying to figure out how to help. "He's a great kid," Hunter said, changing the topic suddenly. "Yeah, he is." As they watched Cody scamper around the park, Daisy stole furtive glances at Hunter. She couldn't understand why he seemed so interested in them, or why she felt so at ease around him. But she also couldn't deny how nice it felt. If only his days here weren't numbered, but that was just wishful thinking, and she needed to focus on reality. Chapter 11. Hunter. Hunter spared one final glance in the mirror before he headed down to the lobby. Daisy had said they would be by at 6 to pick him up so they could go to the carnival together, and it was now 5 till. Though he wasn't sure what to expect from tonight, the nervous feeling racing through his body surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been nervous before a date, or the last time he'd so looked forward to one. Nor could he understand why Daisy seemed to have taken up a permanent residence in his mind. Another pang of guilt fluttered in Hunter's stomach that he hadn't told her the truth yet. Daisy deserved so much more than what life had dished out to her. She deserved happiness and time with her son. And Cody needed more time with his mother. Hunter knew that from first-hand experience. His world had been rocked when his mother left, but he'd had his father to lean upon. Unfortunately, just like Daisy, his father had turned to working, and Hunter had been forced to grow up with half a parent instead of 2. He didn't want that for Cody, but he still had no idea how to help Daisy. After their ice cream excursion the night before, he had returned to the inn and brainstormed ways to bring her vision to life. Having no idea how profitable either a dude ranch might be or a game hall, he'd placed a call to Davis asking him to look into it. Maybe, if he could come up with a solution that would make just as much money, if not more, he could convince Goldman to leave Daisy's land alone. At 6 o'clock on the dot, the inn's front door opened, and Daisy, Fanny, and Cody appeared on the other side.
"Mr. Hunter, are you ready?"
Cody asked, racing toward him.
"Mommy said I have to wait to eat, and now I'm starving."
Hunter squatted down to be on eye level with the boy. "I am ready, and I also waited to eat, so I'm starving too."
"Let's go then. A few years ago, there was this really fun game where you got to throw darts at a balloon. My dad won me a giant teddy bear. Maybe you can win something this year."
"I'll sure try," Hunter said, flashing the boy a wink before straightening and looking to Daisy. She looked beautiful tonight in a pair of shorts and a red, white, and blue striped top that hung off one shoulder, accentuating her slender neck and collarbone. He'd managed to find a t-shirt with a flag on it for himself at the general store in town this afternoon, but she definitely looked better than he did. However, it was her hair that held his attention the most. He'd always seen it pulled back or under a hat, but she wore it down tonight, and it flowed down her back and around her shoulders like a stream of golden honey. He wondered how it would feel beneath his fingertips. "Are we ready then?" Daisy's voice pulled him out of his daydream and back to reality, and he felt a heat crawl up his neck. Had he been staring? He hoped not, but from the amused expression on her face, he was fairly certain he had been. "Yep, let's go." Just like the night before, Fanny and Cody ended up ahead of them, Cody's animated voice filling the air as he chattered on about everything he wanted to eat and see. Hunter smiled as he listened to the boy's exuberance. "You know, I'm expecting something amazing based on how excited he is," he said to Daisy. She smiled and nodded. He's always loved all the festivals, but they are more fun when you look at them from a child's eye. This one isn't even his favorite, but I think he's so excited because he's been sitting at home for a while. She paused and pursed her lips together before continuing. "And because of you." "Me? Why me?" Hunter liked Cody, and the boy had been like a constant shadow most of the time he was at Daisy's ranch, but he had a hard time buying that the boy's excitement was tied to his existence. Daisy's face took on a wistful expression. "He's been without his father for a year. Honestly, I think he's just enjoying the male company." Right. Hunter should have known that. Fathers were important for boys. especially young boys around Cody's age. Hunter remembered playing catch and football with his own father at about this age. Well, I'm enjoying his company too. And yours. A soft pink color spread across her cheeks, and her gaze shifted back to the boy in front of them. Suddenly, the downtown area came into view. Hunter was surprised by how it had been transformed. Along the streets, pop-up games had been set up with bins of prizes beside them. Brightly colored balloons bobbed in the soft breeze from their tied positions, and the salty scent of popcorn and other fried foods hung in the air. Wow, this is actually more than I expected. We might be small, but this town knows how to celebrate. Just wait until dark when the fireworks go off. Hunter's pulse quickened at the thought of watching fireworks in the dark with Daisy. But before he could finally enjoy the idea, she had grabbed his hand and was tugging him to the left. Yes, I was hoping they'd be here. They have the best pizza in Texas. She smiled broadly as she came to a stop in front of a brightly colored food truck painted like the Italian flag. The words, "It's Italiano," were scrawled across the side. It sure smells good. Hunter's stomach growled as the scent of garlic and cheese filled his nose. Cody punched his fist in the air. This day is awesome! They ordered their slices and then carried them to a seating area that had been set up near the food trucks. After a quick prayer from Fanny, Hunter took a bite of the slice and had to agree that it was indeed one of the best pieces of pizza he'd ever had. As they ate, the tables around them filled, and Hunter was struck by how many people crowded the area. Are there really this many people in this town? Fanny chuckled. There are more people in town than you'd think, but our festivals are renowned. People come from all over to check them out. Hunter wondered what he could do with that information. What if he could find a way to bring people in from all over at other times as well? There had to be some way to satisfy Goldman and help Daisy keep her land. Can we go play some games now? Cody asked after swallowing his last bite of pizza. I want to throw the darts again and do the ring toss. Hang on, Tiger, Daisy said with a laugh, as she gathered up their empty plates and napkins. There's plenty of time for games before the fireworks begin. After depositing their trash, they made their way to the row of carnival games, where Hunter proceeded to win a stuffed tiger for Cody, a hat for Fanny, and a miniature carved horse for Daisy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had so much fun. With the games conquered, they made their way to the gazebo, where a small band had set up and was playing old country favorites while people danced in the streets. Do you dance? Daisy asked, her eyes sparkling. He didn't, at least not normally, but he was so struck by the excitement in her eyes that he could not say no. Besides, he couldn't deny he wanted to feel her in his arms, so he nodded and held out his hand. She handed her horse to Fanny and placed one hand in his and the other on his shoulder. The skin under her touch pulsed and tingled, affecting Hunter in ways no woman before ever had. As he placed a hand on her trim waist and pulled her closer, the soft floral scent of her shampoo filled his nose. Though he never would have believed it, he realized there was no other place he'd rather be than dancing with her in the middle of the street. What was happening to him? This wasn't how his trip was supposed to go, but he seemed helpless to stop the feelings that were developing for the woman he held in his arms. Before he knew it, the sun had set, and people gathered in the grassy area to watch the fireworks explode. Fanny spread out a large blanket she had brought, and the four of them sat down. Moments later, the music began again, and the sound of booms and shrieks filled the air. Hunter smiled as he listened to Cody exclaim that every firework was his favorite, but he found it hard to stay focused on the exploding balls of color. Instead, his eyes kept glancing to the side, to the mesmerizing woman who sat mere inches from him. He wondered how her body would feel in his arms, how heavy her head would be against his chest, and most importantly, how soft her lips would feel against his. As if she felt his gaze, Daisy turned his direction and flashed a smile. It wasn't the first smile she'd given, but there was something different about it, something free and endearing. It was a smile that struck his core. He knew at that moment that he would do whatever it took to keep that smile on her face forever. Chapter 12. Daisy. Daisy found herself whistling as she changed out of her church clothes and into her ranch gear that afternoon. Though Hunter hadn't accepted her invitation to join them at church that morning, he had agreed to join them for lunch and stay to help out around the ranch afterwards. And though she knew she shouldn't be, she was eager to see him again. The carnival the night before had been so much fun, and she honestly couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so happy. Certainly not since Ethan's death. As her gaze fell on the miniature horse Hunter had won her, she glanced up at the ceiling. Would Ethan be angry at her attraction to this new man, or would he understand? She hoped he would understand. After all, she did need help on this ranch, and Cody needed a man in his life. But she was getting ahead of herself. It had been one night, one very fun and relaxing night, but Hunter had given her no indication of his interest to pursue anything serious or stay any longer than his story required. At that sobering thought, her smile slipped and she sighed. She needed to rein in her heart and her mind before they ran away from her and left her heartbroken once more. Tucking in her shirt, she grabbed her hat from the dresser and headed to the kitchen.
"What's with the long face?"
Fanny asked as she handed Daisy a bowl of biscuits.
"You seemed so much happier this morning."
"It's nothing," Daisy said, shaking her head. She knew if she told Fanny, her aunt would just tell her to pray about it, which wasn't a bad idea. If God wanted her and Hunter to be together, he would find a way. And if he didn't, well, then she would consider it a closed door. At that moment, the doorbell rang, and Daisy chuckled at the irony of the timing. Setting the bowl on the table, she hurried to the front door to let Hunter in. Determined to enjoy whatever time with him she had, she swung the door open and flashed a welcoming smile. He looked dashing in the green button-down shirt and blue jeans he wore, and Daisy found herself captivated in his gaze. "Hey." "Hey yourself," he said, his voice low and slightly husky. "How are you?" The simple 3 words held so much more meaning as he stared down into her eyes. Daisy felt as if he could see her soul and all her insecurities. "I'm good. How about you? Did you sleep well?" His eyes danced as the corners of his lips lifted in a light grin. "I certainly had good dreams." Daisy did not miss his insinuation that she had been in those dreams. But before she could respond, Cody barreled into the room.
"Mr. Hunter, you're here. Aunt Fanny says to wash up because lunch is ready."
Grateful for the interruption, Daisy stepped back to allow him entry. "I guess we better not keep her waiting." "I guess not," Hunter said with a soft sigh. He followed her into the kitchen, and they gathered around the table for lunch. Though delicious, Daisy couldn't really focus on anything other than Hunter. When the food was gone, he helped her clear the table before following her out to the barn to finish the chores for the day. "I wanted to say thank you," he said as she handed him a brush. "For what?" "For letting me come with you last night. I can't remember the last time I had so much fun." As he reached to grab the brush, their fingers touched, and Daisy felt the tingles shoot up her arm. Her throat tightened, and her breath stilled. "Me either." The stillness settled around them like a barrier against the outside world as they stared at each other. She wondered if he would kiss her. She wondered if she wanted him to. His lips parted, and he took a step closer to her. "Daisy, His sentence was interrupted by Fanny's holler from the back door.
"Daisy! Daisy, where are you?"
While not frantic, Fanny's voice held a note of concern that Daisy didn't often hear in it. "I better go see what she needs," Daisy said, stepping back and breaking the spell that had been around them. I'll come with you. Fanny stood on the back porch, wringing her hands together. Cody stood next to her.
What is it, Aunt Fanny?
There's something wrong with the sink, Fanny said. Daisy sighed and rolled her eyes. Of course. Why wouldn't there be something wrong with the sink? What's wrong with it? Hunter asked.
It won't drain, Cody said. I asked her if she unplugged it, but she said it wasn't plugged.
He stuck his chest out as if he was proud of coming up with a solution, even if it didn't work.
Come in and take a look for yourself.
She led the way into the house and pointed at the kitchen sink.
I was washing the dishes, but when I pulled the plug, the water just sat there.
Daisy peered into the sink. There was no standing water now, but she didn't doubt Fanny's word. The woman didn't have a lying bone in her body. But why did it have to be a plumbing issue? She knew nothing about plumbing. It sounds like you might have a clogged drain, Hunter said. Do you have baking soda and vinegar? Fanny placed her hands on her hips.
Of course we do. But what are you going to do with it?
Hunter chuckled. I'm going to fix the clog with it.
You can fix a clog with baking soda and vinegar?
Cody stared at Hunter, a look of pure admiration on his face. Daisy shot him a questioning glance. You know about clogged drains? Hunter shrugged. I had a roommate in college who was a health nut. He wouldn't use chemicals of any kind. One day, the sink in our dorm room got clogged, and he whipped out this remedy.
Well, I've never heard of fixing a clog with baking soda and vinegar, Fanny said, but I'll let you try.
She pointed her finger at him and narrowed her eyes.
If you make it worse, though, you have to pay for the plumber.
Deal, he said with a laugh. Also, I need a 1-cup measuring cup and some boiling water.
I'll get the measuring cup,
Cody shouted, hurrying toward the drawer before anyone else could steal his claimed job. I guess that leaves me getting the water, Daisy said with a smile. Thankfully, Fanny nearly always had some water boiling for tea. Daisy checked the kettle to make sure there was water in it, and then flicked on the stove burner. With a soft click, the blue and red flame appeared, and Daisy turned the burner down to a manageable level. So, how does this work? Daisy asked as they waited for the water to boil. The actual chemistry of it? I'm not really sure, but once the water boils, we'll pour some down the sink. Then we pour a cup of baking soda and a solution of 1 cup water and 1 cup vinegar down the sink. Then we plug the drain. I figure it's kind of like the volcano experiment we used to do in middle school science.
We get to make a volcano in middle school?
This time, Cody turned his incredulous expression on Daisy. She couldn't help but smile. This was certainly turning out to be an exciting day for him. It depends on your teacher, but I did, Hunter answered.
Cool!
The kettle chose that moment to whistle, and the three watched as Hunter performed his science experiment. Okay, now just set a timer for 10 minutes, and when that goes off, pour some more boiling water down the drain, and the problem should be fixed.
Well, thank you, Hunter,
Fanny said as she shot a look at Daisy.
I think we owe him a thank you, don't we, Daisy?
Daisy could tell Aunt Fanny was hinting at something, but she had no idea what. However, if this worked, she did owe Hunter a hearty thanks, as he would be saving her the cost of a plumber. A cost she couldn't afford? Yes, we do. Thank you, Hunter. An awkward smile alighted on his lips as he looked from Daisy to Fanny. Clearly, he could tell Fanny was hinting at something as well. Of course, you're welcome.
No, I meant a proper thank you, Fanny said. You should invite him out to dinner.
Well, I'm not one to turn down dinner with a beautiful woman, Hunter said, holding her gaze. But it's not necessary. I didn't do anything special. Daisy was about to agree. She knew what this was really about, and it wasn't a thank you. Fanny was clearly trying to push them together. But before she could answer, Fanny shot her a pointed glare. Rolling her eyes at her aunt, she turned to Hunter. No, she's right. Besides, it will give you something else to write about in that piece of yours. And give us some time together alone, she added to herself, though she wasn't sure if that thought excited her or terrified her more. Hunter glanced from Daisy to Fanny and back again before nodding. All right, then. What did you have in mind? There wasn't much to have in mind. Soda Spurs certainly didn't boast a booming restaurant life. But there was one upscale restaurant that came to mind. However, it was the same restaurant she and Ethan had always eaten at to celebrate their anniversary. Could she really go there with another man? She glanced at Fanny, but as if reading her mind, the woman nodded and urged her to continue. Daisy inhaled deeply and forced the words out. There's a nice restaurant downtown. It's near the inn, actually. How about I meet you at the inn at 6 and we go to dinner? Well, I do have to eat, Hunter said, his lips curling up into a grin. Can I come too? Cody asked.
Nope, but how about I make you my special 4-cheese mac and cheese for dinner tonight?
Fanny offered, in an effort to appease Cody. His frown immediately shifted into a smile, and he danced a little jig across the floor.
Yes, I love mac and cheese.
Over Cody's head, Daisy caught Hunter's gaze. The intensity in his stare made her heart skip a beat, and she wondered just what this date tonight might mean. Chapter 13. Hunter. Hunter hurried through his shower that evening. He wanted to make sure he was dressed and ready when Daisy arrived. Though he wasn't sure if she considered it a date, there was no harm in looking presentable when having dinner with a beautiful woman. The image of Brittany flooded his mind, followed closely with tiny pinpricks of guilt, but Hunter brushed them aside. What he had with Brittany wasn't serious. He had known that before he arrived in this town, but it was even more obvious now. The fact that Daisy had consumed his thoughts told him that no matter what happened between them, he'd have to break things off with Brittany as soon as he returned to the city. After tucking his shirt into his designer jeans, he ran a little gel through his hair, moving the strands until they fell in the exact place he wanted them. Then he brushed his teeth, gave himself one more glance in the mirror, and turned out the light. A check of his watch showed that he still had 5 minutes to spare.
Well, aren't you looking dapper?
Dixie said as he passed the check-in desk.
You got a hot date tonight?
Though the question sounded innocent, he could see the hungry desire for information flashing in her brown eyes. No doubt she would take whatever he told her and turn it into town gossip, to be disseminated by word of mouth faster than a fleeting summer shower. Daisy had confirmed that while not always gossipy, the town definitely had a rumor mill. Not a date, but I am meeting Daisy Keller for dinner. He left it there, hoping she would drop the subject, but it was not to be.
Dinner?
She lifted one eyebrow.
That sounds like a date to me.
No, she simply wanted to thank me for fixing a clogged sink today. Besides, I need all the material I can get on small-town life to do my article justice. Dixie took a step toward him and placed a hand on his arm.
If it's more of the town you need to see, I'd be happy to show you around.
Hunter didn't want to upset the woman. He still wanted to stay here a few more days. But the touch of her hand sent unwanted chills up his arm. Thank you, Dixie. Perhaps when I finish my research at the ranch, I'll take you up on that offer. He had no intention of doing anything of the sort, but it appeared to appease the woman, though she did not drop her hand from his arm until the front door opened. Knock, knock, Daisy said, poking her head inside. Relief flooded Hunter's body, and he stepped toward Daisy and away from the desperate clinging touch of Dixie. I'm here and ready to go. Daisy flashed a smile before waving to Dixie. Good to see you, Dixie.
You too,
Dixie replied, but the brightness in her tone felt forced to Hunter.
Have fun, and don't stay out too late. We do have a curfew here.
A curfew? Seriously? How had he missed that on the agreement? He turned to say something to her, but Daisy took his elbow and ushered him out the door. When it was firmly closed behind them, she shook her head and laughed. No use arguing with Dixie. It's clear she's got her sights set on you. I bet you get the 3rd degree when you get back tonight. Hunter chuckled as he followed her down the steps. I think I got a preview of that before you arrived. But how can you tell she's got her sights set on me? Daisy stopped and stared at him with wide eyes. Are you serious? She looked at you like you were a piece of steak in the middle of a beef ration. Hunter wasn't sure whether to laugh or be disgusted at that image. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words would come. Are you telling me you didn't pick up on her vibes? Daisy shook her head as she resumed walking. Obviously, that had been a rhetorical question. Are men always so clueless? About women? Yeah, most of the time. In my experience, women rarely say what they mean and change their minds constantly. He chuckled as he remembered the many women he had dated over the years, and how no matter why they officially broke up, miscommunication was always at the heart of it. That's not true. She folded her arms across her chest. Some of us know exactly what we want. Do you? He wondered if she really did. There'd been enough moments between them that he thought she felt an attraction to him, but she'd made no move. Of course, he hadn't either, but that's because he still needed to tell her the truth. Her eyes shifted to the side. About most things I do. Hunter could have pushed the issue, but he could sense that, like him, she wasn't sure what was happening between them or how to proceed, so he decided to let it go. Somehow I can see that about you. It's actually kind of refreshing. It is? The cloud lifted from her face, and her smile returned. It's another thing I love about living in a small town. People here don't need to lie or cover things up. Life is simple, and even if they tried, someone would see whatever they were hiding, and it would be out in the open soon enough. Her words stirred up the sensation of guilt in Hunter's stomach again. He hated that he was lying to her. He needed to come clean, and soon, before someone else found out who he was. Daisy, he began, but before he could continue, she stopped. Here we are, the Black Stallion, the best steak in soda Spurs. She turned to him, her face serious. I hope you like steak. I probably should have asked, but really, this is not only one of the only restaurants in town, but it's definitely got the best food. He smiled at her ramblings. She was even cuter when she rambled. Don't worry, I love steak. Good. Her hand stole to her face and tucked a strand of hair behind her ears. It was a gesture he hadn't seen her do before, and one that definitely displayed her nervousness. The question was, why? Was it because it was their first time being truly alone? Shall we go in? He pulled open the door and stepped back, allowing her to enter first. Yes, of course. Hard to eat if we aren't inside. Her voice trailed up at the end, almost as if she were asking a question, and he bit back a smile when he saw her shake her head, as if mentally berating herself for sounding so silly. The hostess, clad in dark pants and a white shirt, led them to a table. The room was not fancy, not compared to the places he ate in the city, but it had a certain charm. A small vase of flowers sat at the edge of every table, and the silverware had been wrapped in white cloth napkins. There were no candles, but the lights over the tables were hung low enough that the dim light they provided felt almost like a cocoon around the tables. Your waiter will be right with you, the hostess said, setting down 2 black folders that Hunter assumed held the menu. Hunter held Daisy's chair out for her, earning a pleasantly shocked expression before taking his own seat. So this is where you go when you want to class it up, huh? There were only a few other people in the restaurant, but none of them were dressed as nicely as himself, or Daisy for that matter. She looked beautiful in the yellow skirt and white shirt she was wearing, an altogether different look from her normal jeans and flannel shirt attire. Well, I haven't been here in ages, but yeah, there aren't many other opportunities here. Some people go to the next town over when they want something more elegant. Do you ever miss it? He asked suddenly, the words spilling out of his mouth before he had a chance to stop them. The city? She asked. He nodded. Yeah, the city, the opportunities, the entertainment. Daisy tilted her head as she thought. I guess a little, every now and then, but there's so much more here. I don't have to worry about Cody's safety if he goes outside without me. I know what is being taught in his classroom because most of his teachers attend my church. Plus, there's less noise, less traffic, less crime. It's a trade-off, but one I think I'm happy with. As he listened to her rattle off her reasons, he wondered if he could find contentment here as she had. The city had a lot to offer, but the one thing it didn't have was the woman sitting across from him who seemed to have stolen his heart. Chapter 14. Daisy. It was still early when they finished dinner and paid the bill, and Daisy didn't really want the night to end yet. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had a nice dinner out without Cody. Would you like to go for a walk? There's not much to see, but the downtown is peaceful at night, and we could visit the park again. Hunter smiled at her. I'd like that. As Daisy's heart fluttered in her chest, she reminded herself again that this wasn't a date, and she didn't have feelings for Hunter. But it was getting harder to ignore his wonderful traits. First, he'd sucked up whatever city boy pride he'd had the first day and really thrown himself into the work. Second, he'd been amazing with Cody. She didn't know if he had kids, but it was obvious he'd had some practice interacting with them. Not everyone had that skill. Then, he'd won them all trinkets at the carnival, and finally he had fixed her sink with MacGyver-like skills and pulled out her chair for her at dinner. Other than the fact that he didn't live here, and she wasn't sure he was a believer, he was marking off all her requirements for a man. Tell me about your life back home, she said, as they stepped out into the warm summer air. What do you do for fun? They'd spoken often of what she did for fun, but she suddenly realized she didn't know as much about his life back home. The muscles in his strong jaw tensed, and he pressed his lips into a thin line. Had she crossed some hidden line, or was he just thinking? You know, he finally said, his words coming out like a sigh. Before coming here, I loved my life, or rather I thought I did. I make decent money, I have a job I enjoy, and I live in a large, beautiful apartment. Most people in the city would envy my life. What's changed? Daisy asked, trying not to fan the spark of hope that flickered in her chest. Though she still wasn't sure she was ready to fully open her heart, she wanted him to say that it was meeting her that had changed him, that maybe it would even be enough that he would consider moving here. He stopped and turned to face her. I have this beautiful apartment in the city, but you know what I do most nights? Daisy shook her head. I grab takeout on my way home from work or have something delivered. Then I sit in my big, beautiful apartment by myself and eat dinner while I watch TV. That sounds sad, he chuckled. I didn't think it was until I saw you and Fanny and Cody. Don't get me wrong, I have friends there who I hang out with on occasion. But family dinners haven't been in my life for a long time. Long enough that I didn't realize what I was missing. His smile faded as he stared into Daisy's eyes. I know I don't know you well, Daisy, but you've changed my perspective on things, on life, and I'll never forget that. The look he was giving her sent her heart thudding in her chest, and her mouth suddenly felt as dry as the Sahara. You're welcome, she managed, though the words felt like sandpaper in her throat. Electricity crackled in the air between them, and as Hunter held her gaze, she wondered if he wanted to kiss her. Did she want him to kiss her? Daisy? Yes? Her throat was so tight that the word came out little more than a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. Daisy, there you are. I need to speak with you. Daisy blinked at the intrusion of the voice. Was that Sheriff Gillespie? What could he possibly want? She turned to see the man hurrying toward her, his expression a storm cloud. Daisy, I need a word with you, he repeated when he reached them. Fire flashed from his eyes as he looked at Hunter. What is it, Sheriff? I'm assuming this is your writer friend. Condescension dripped from his voice, and a hardness that she'd never seen before distorted his features. It is. Daisy looked to Hunter and was surprised to see his posture stiffen. What's going on? Do you want to tell her, Hunter, or should I? The sheriff emphasized Hunter's name, making it sound more like a sneer. Daisy, I was trying to tell you. Tell me what? Daisy was seriously confused now. That his name isn't Hunter Goldsby, the sheriff said. He hooked his thumbs in his belt loops and rocked back as if proud of what he'd found out. What? Daisy whirled on Hunter. What is he talking about? His name is Hunter Garrison. The sheriff emphasized the last name and paused for a moment as if to let it sink in. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because he's the owner of the firm trying to buy your land. The words felt like a punch to Daisy's gut. Here she'd been thinking, maybe she could open her heart again, but he'd only been pretending, trying to get her to lower her walls so he could get her to sell her land. Is that true? Remorse and sadness flickered in his eyes. It is, but it's not what you think. Are you trying to deny that you came here to convince her to sell? Sheriff Gillespie asked. His hands dropped from his belt loops, and his shoulders squared back as if preparing for a fight. No, Hunter said with a sigh. He's right about some things. My name is Hunter Garrison, and I do own the company offering to buy your land. I was sent here to try to convince you to sell, but I couldn't do it. As she listened to him lie, a burning heat ignited in her stomach. With hot talons, it clawed up her neck, sending a flash of red over her cheeks. Tendons in her neck bulged as her jaw clenched, and sparks flew from her eyes. Her posture grew rigid except for her hands, which clenched so tightly that her knuckles began to turn white, and divots developed in her palms from her nails. Then, a trembling took over her body as if every ounce of concentration was being used to keep from blowing up at him. And I'm supposed to believe that? You lied to me. You didn't even tell me your real name. And I'm supposed to believe you couldn't do your job because... Why? Because I saw how much the ranch meant to you. Because I saw how many people depended on you. Because I saw the relationship between you and Cody and Fanny. Because I fell for you. He reached out to touch her arm, but Daisy yanked it out of his reach. Don't, Daisy spat. There's no need to keep lying to me now. I'm not. Look, I spoke with the partner who sent me and tried to convince him to let you keep your land, but he wouldn't agree. Daisy crossed her arms and scoffed. He wouldn't agree? I thought you owned the company. Small lines formed around his mouth as his lips pursed. Technically, I do, but my father put a provision in his will that the company isn't really mine until I prove myself. Prove yourself? Is that what this was about? Anger surged in Daisy's body, sending a hot flame up her neck. Hunter shook his head. No, that's not what I meant. Look, according to Goldman, the partner who sent me here, my father wanted to buy your land to build a dude ranch. That's why I was asking if you had ever considered it. I was trying to come up with a solution that would allow you to keep your land and also satisfy Goldman."
"Well, I don't need your help," Daisy said, sticking out her chin. "You can go back to your big city and tell your boss that I'm not selling, no matter what."
Having said her piece, she turned and stormed away from the two men.
Daisy, wait up!"
Daisy heard the sheriff's voice, but she was in no mood to talk to him either. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, and all she wanted to do was go home, eat a bowl of double fudge ice cream, and berate her stupidity for trusting Hunter and letting him in her life, even if only for a few days.
"I'm sorry I had to be the one to tell you," the sheriff said when he caught up with her. "But I heard he was spending a lot of time with you."
Daisy managed a nod, but kept her pace brisk and her eyes on the ground.
"I couldn't let him get away with it."
"I appreciate it, Sheriff, but I'd rather not talk about it right now." With that, Daisy hastened her steps until she heard his footsteps fade behind her. She made it to her car before the tears escaped. Glancing around, she swiped the wetness from her cheeks before sliding into her car. "Why am I crying over him? It's not like we were dating or anything," she thought to herself as she placed the key in the ignition. But she knew the answer. For the first time since Ethan's death, she'd felt an attraction to another man. For the first time since his death, she'd seen Cody relate to a man and display a genuine smile once again. Most importantly, for the first time since Ethan's death, she'd thought about opening her heart again, only to have it shut down once more. Chapter 15. Hunter. Hunter shoved his hands in his pockets as he walked back to the inn. What was he going to do now? He couldn't go back to Goldman empty-handed, but he doubted Daisy would listen to any of his ideas. He should have told her the truth from the beginning.
"Whoa, why the long face?"
Dixie asked as he entered. Hunter sighed. Though the story was none of her business, he felt the need to talk to someone. It might as well be Dixie.
"I messed up." "You look like you need to take a load off. Why don't you come into the kitchen and I'll get us some coffee?"
Hunter nodded and followed her into the homey kitchen. He took a seat at the small table while she began brewing a pot of coffee. Normally, the smell and the sound of coffee percolating brightened his day, but he wasn't sure anything was going to help right now.
"So, how exactly did you mess up?"
Dixie asked as she set a mug and some sugar in front of him.
"I lied."
He held her gaze to gauge her reaction as he stated the two simple words. She lifted one eyebrow and blew on her mug.
"Okay, lying isn't good. What exactly did you lie about?"
"Who I am?" Hunter expected her to get angry or kick him out, but she didn't. Instead, she took a slow sip of her coffee.
"Okay, you've got my attention. Who are you?"
"My name is Hunter Garrison, and I was sent here to try and get Daisy Keller to sell her land to the Garrison and Son Corporation, so we can build a dude ranch on it."
"Your corporation?"
"Sort of." Hunter shrugged his shoulders as he took a sip of coffee. "I worked there with my father. When he died, he left me the company." Dixie's brow furrowed.
"So why don't you just find other land?"
"Well, he left me the company, but in name only. I don't really have any power in decision-making until I prove myself, but I don't know how to do that. He didn't specify what he was looking for in the will."
"I see. That is a pickle. So, what are you going to do?"
Dixie asked. Hunter shook his head. "What can I do? When Daisy found out, she stormed off. I wanted to try and brainstorm ways for her to keep her ranch and satisfy my company as well. But there's no way she'll listen to me now. All I can hope to do is go back and convince Goldman not to continue to pressure her to sell."
"Do you think that will work?"
"No, but I don't know what else to try." A sick feeling settled in Hunter's stomach. Not only had he lost the deal, but he'd lost Daisy too, and he wasn't sure which one bothered him more.
"Have you tried praying about it?"
Dixie asked. "I'm not really much of a praying person," Hunter answered, shifting in his seat. This conversation had just taken a turn for the uncomfortable.
"That's okay. I wasn't either at one time, but here's what I can tell you. I've faced a lot of things that felt too big for me, that probably were too big for me, but nothing is too big for God. Right now, you see no way out of this, but He might have a plan. If you get stuck, you could always try asking."
"Yeah, I guess I could," Hunter said, but he had no plans to follow through. He was pretty sure even God couldn't fix this. Tomorrow he would pack up and return to the city. Hopefully he could convince Goldman to let it go. Hunter took a deep breath before pulling open the door to the firm the next day. He'd thought about what he was going to say on the entire drive back, but he still wasn't sure how Goldman would react.
"Mr. Garrison, you're back,"
Bree said with a bright smile.
"It hasn't been the same without you."
"Thank you, Bree." Hunter returned the smile, but could not muster his normal flirtation. "Can you call Mr. Goldman and see if he can see me?" Bree's smile faded as she processed his tone and change in demeanor.
"Sure. One moment, sir."
She tapped a button on her phone and paused. After a quick exchange with the person on the other end, she ended the call and nodded to Hunter.
"You can go ahead and go up."
Hunter returned the nod and headed toward the elevators. As the door closed behind him, he took a few deep breaths and tried once again to formulate his thoughts. How would Goldman react when Hunter refused to go back? What could they do to punish him if they couldn't fire him? Goldman's secretary waved him through as he entered the large office foyer.
"He's expecting you,"
she said, barely glancing in his direction. With a final deep breath, Hunter pushed the door open. Goldman looked up from the papers on his desk and motioned him in. "You're back sooner than I expected. Were you able to convince her to sell?" "No, sir, I wasn't." Goldman put his pen down and folded his hands. "And why not?" Hunter thought about using the excuse that his cover had been blown before he could convince Daisy, but he knew that was just an excuse. "Because it's not right." Goldman's brow lifted. "Excuse me?" "Look, maybe it was my father's last wish." Hunter wished he knew that for sure. Not that it would change his decision now, but Daisy needs that ranch. She lost her husband last year, and she's running it by herself. She has a son and an elderly aunt who lives with her. Plus, she employs people in the town. She's had to let some of them go, but I refuse to make her have to fire any more. Goldman leaned back in his chair and stroked his chin. "That is not our concern. Our concern is buying the land and making a profit." "Well, that shouldn't be our concern. I know my father and I didn't always see eye to eye, but if I'm going to take this firm over one day, I want to do it differently. I want to help people like Daisy." Hunter pressed his lips together to keep from rambling any further. He'd said his piece, and now he just had to wait to see what Goldman would say. "What do you have in mind?" Hunter's mouth parted and he blinked at the man. Was he really going to listen to Hunter's ideas? "Daisy mentioned opening a horse youth camp. What if we did that in conjunction with a dude ranch? We have the land on either side of her, right?" Goldman nodded. "So what if we opened one on each side of her? We could open the youth camp and employ even more of the townspeople. She's right, there isn't much that kids can do in that town. But with our money, we could bring in horses for them to ride and learn how to care for them. Maybe we could even add some sort of game hall for them to have a place to safely hang out." "How would we make money on it?" Goldman asked. "Obviously, we would charge a fee for use. We could also have a fee for the game hall, but I think most of the money would come from the dude ranch on the other side. It will be a little smaller than we'd originally hoped without Daisy's land, but it can be done. You care enough about this woman to accept lower profits? I care about her and the town. It's small, but it's a good place to unwind. With a few more tourists coming in, the businesses there could thrive. They specialize in festivals, and people come from all over for them. We could add to that and really grow the town. Goldman stared at him so long that Hunter wondered if the man had suffered a stroke or seizure. Finally, a wide smile broke across his face. It had been so long since Hunter had seen him smile that it took him off guard at first. Had the man lost his mind? Congratulations, Hunter, Goldman said, standing and extending his hand. Hunter stared down at the man's hand in confusion. Congratulations? For what? Ignoring his rude behavior, Goldman leaned forward and grabbed Hunter's hand, pumping it vigorously. For proving yourself. You just met your father's condition. The company is now yours completely. I don't understand. Goldman smiled at him the way a grandfather would. Your father wanted you to learn that there are things more important than money, and he wanted you to have a vision for the company. So, the money is all mine? Goldman's smile faltered. It is, but I hope this doesn't change your desire. No, not at all, Hunter answered quickly. I just wasn't expecting this when I came in here. To be honest, I wasn't sure you'd ever meet your father's requirement. I was afraid I'd have to run the company forever. Now I can finally retire. This is the happiest day of my life. Hunter left Goldman's office in a stupor. On one hand, he was glad that he'd finally met his father's requirement, and he was glad that Goldman could move on with his life. But what did this mean for Hunter? True, he had the money now, more than he could probably ever spend. But what he really wanted was Daisy, and she still felt completely out of reach. Chapter 16. Daisy.
Why the long face this morning?
Fanny asked as Daisy pushed her eggs around on her plate. Daisy sighed. She hadn't felt like talking when she'd gotten home last night, and she wasn't sure she felt like it now either. But Fanny deserved an explanation. It turns out Hunter isn't who he said he was.
What do you mean?
Fanny pulled out her chair and sat down across from Daisy. His real name is Hunter Garrison, and he owns the firm that's trying to buy the ranch. Fanny's eyebrow quirked.
Did he say why they wanted to buy the land?
Evidently, the company wants to open a dude ranch, but does it really matter? He lied to me, and he lied to you, she added, knowing how much Fanny hated being lied to.
But he never pressured you to sell, did he? I mean, I wasn't out there, but I never heard him mention it.
Daisy thought for a moment. No, it never came up, but I'm sure it would have.
Are you?
Of course I am. He was probably just trying to get me to relax my guard before he brought it up. Whose side are you on anyway?
All I'm saying is that maybe he came here under false pretenses, but changed his mind once he got to know you.
That's a nice thought, Aunt Fanny, but there's really no evidence to back that up. Besides, even if he did, I doubt he'll stay after last night. I was pretty adamant in my anger when I left him.
Left who?
Cody asked, bounding into the room.
Was it Hunter? When is he coming today? I want to show him this picture I drew.
Cody held up a drawing of 4 stick figures standing next to a house. Daisy's heart sank as she realized that one of the stick figures probably represented Hunter. He's not coming back, baby. It turns out that Hunter was lying to us. He's not a writer. He was here trying to get me to sell the ranch.
Why would he do that? Did he want to buy it so he could live here too?
No, honey. He wanted to buy it so he could turn it into a dude ranch. His face folded in an expression of confusion, and then denial.
I don't know what a dude ranch is. I don't believe you. Hunter was nice, and he liked us. He wouldn't do that."
With that, he stomped back to his room and slammed the door. Daisy knew she should tell him that slamming doors was not allowed, but she also understood his anger. This was her fault. She should have done a better job of vetting Hunter before she let him hang around her son. She'd just been so excited to see him smiling again.
"Don't worry, I'll talk to him,"
Fanny said as Daisy pushed her chair back. "Thank you. I need to get to work, especially because I didn't even get the payment from Hunter."
"Maybe he'll surprise you and come back,"
Fanny said as she gathered the plates and headed for the sink. Maybe, but Daisy didn't think so. Daisy performed her chores with none of her usual enjoyment. Everywhere she looked, she saw Hunter. How had he managed to invade her life so fully in such a short time? She saddled Mina, trying not to think about how nice it had been to have him ride the property with her. She'd been alone for so long that she'd forgotten how loneliness felt. But it came crashing back like a tsunami now, threatening to drag her under. Why, God? Why did you send this man into my life only to take him away again? She received no answer, but she hadn't really expected one. She'd pulled away from God in the last year, and she was pretty sure he was no longer listening to her prayers. With a sigh, she swung up on the horse and led the mare out of the barn. As she rode around the property, she wondered how much longer she would be able to keep the land. Hunter might not have pressed her to sell, but she had no doubt that the company would keep hounding her. Where would she go? She supposed she could return to the city and get a job there. But would Fanny come? Would Cody adjust to it? Would she even fit back in? She'd been here so long that she wasn't sure she could. But what other choice did she have? It wasn't like jobs were a dime a dozen here in Spurs. As she neared the barn again and saw the sheriff waiting for her, she realized there was one more choice, but it wasn't one she wanted to consider. "Sheriff, what can I do for you today?" she asked, as she slid off the saddle and led Mina back into the barn.
"I just wanted to check up on you. I know my news last night took you by surprise, but I was only trying to protect you."
"I'm fine, Sheriff, and I certainly appreciate the concern, but it's not necessary."
"Daisy,"
he grabbed her arm to turn her toward him.
"I know the ranch is in trouble. I don't have much saved, but I have good credit. If we got married—"
"Dwight." Daisy hoped using his first name would help her words sink in. "I consider you a good friend, but I can't marry you. I just don't have feelings for you in that way." Guilt blanketed her as she watched his face fall. She should have made her feelings clearer a long time ago, but she'd been hoping to spare him. Now she could see that her omission had only given him hope.
"Oh, I see. Well, I'll get out of your hair then."
He tipped his hat and then turned and exited the barn. As Daisy watched him leave, she realized that she'd done to the sheriff what Hunter had done to her. Their reasons might have been different, but the act of deception had been the same, as had the results. She unsaddled Mina and brushed her down, but she could not brush away the guilt and shame she felt. Chapter 17. Hunter. "Hunter, are you even listening to me?" Brittany asked, tapping her long manicured nail on the table.
"I'm sorry, what did you say?"
He'd agreed to a dinner with Brittany, mainly because he was hoping it would help him forget Daisy. Now that he owned the company, he could still go through with his plan to open a youth camp and a dude ranch. But what would be the point? Without Daisy in his life, he had no desire to live in the small town or run either business. "I was saying that now that you have access to the money, we should take a trip. I've always wanted to take a cruise, or maybe a month-long Hawaiian vacation." Her eyes lit up. "Ooh,
Maybe we could do both.
Hunter stared at her, really seeing her for the first time. Her blonde hair was piled precisely on her head, with a few perfectly curled tendrils framing her heart-shaped face. And the black eyeliner circling her blue eyes made them pop. But the added color on her lids just looked overdone. The bright red of her lips added to that image. Glamorous was a word he might have chosen for her, but he realized he no longer wanted glamorous. He wanted simple, homey. He wanted Daisy. Brittany would never be caught dead watching fireworks on a blanket under the stars, nor would she ever get on a horse or muck stalls. She'd probably never sat on a rock and watched the sunset. Honestly, he wondered if she might even have or want children. He hadn't thought any of those things mattered to him, but all of a sudden, they did. And then Daisy's words came crashing back to him. Sometimes God closed one door to open another. It was clear this door, this time with Brittany, was over, and he couldn't get Daisy out of his mind. Did that mean that perhaps God was trying to tell him he hadn't lost her? That he could still win her back? Brittany, he said, cutting off her ramblings of a perfect vacation, we're not going to do any of those things.
What?
She blinked at him, clearly not understanding.
Why not? You have the money now. We should celebrate.
We? He almost laughed at the word. Funny how it was we who could spend his money, but she hadn't bothered to ask him where he might like to go. We aren't going anywhere because this isn't going anywhere. He motioned to the space between them. She rolled her eyes and huffed as if she thought he was joking.
Don't be silly, Hunter. We've been dating for 3 months. A trip together is a natural progression.
Maybe, he agreed with a nod, if I saw this relationship continuing, but I don't. Her red lips fell open, creating a nearly perfect O shape. I'm sorry, Brittany. It's been fun, mostly, he thought, but you're not the kind of woman I see myself marrying.
Marriage?
The word came out with a derisive snort.
Who said anything about marriage? I don't want to get married anytime soon, and I thought you didn't either.
I didn't think I did until...
Until what?
Her voice took on a shrill tone, but it did not hide the anger coursing through it. Suddenly, her eyes narrowed to slits, and venom laced her words.
You met another woman, didn't you?
I did. He couldn't help the smile that spread across his face as he thought of his time with Daisy. And while I can promise you that nothing happened between us while I was there, I definitely want there to be something between us. He found his resolve bolstering as he spoke. Daisy might have given up on him, but he wasn't giving up on her, not without a fight.
You can't be serious. You aren't really thinking of leaving all of this and moving to that hick town, are you?
Actually, I think I am. The more he thought about it, the better the idea sounded to him. He missed the sunset. He missed seeing the stars at night. He missed the homey feel of the small town and the feeling of family he'd felt with Daisy and Cody and Fanny. Compared to that, the city had little to offer. With a smile, he pulled a $100 bill out of his wallet and set it on the table. This should be enough to cover dinner. I hope you find happiness, Brittany. Hunter could hear her sputtering behind him, but he wasn't turning back. Now that he knew what he wanted, there was no turning back. The only question was, how quickly could he accomplish what he wanted to? It was the following weekend before Hunter was able to get all the ducks in a row. But as he pulled into Daisy's drive and read over the papers one more time, he smiled. This had to be enough to get her to forgive him, and maybe even enough to allow her to give him a second chance. If not, at least he would know he'd helped her out and repaid her for what she'd given him. Folding the papers, he tucked them in his pocket, took a deep breath, and exited his car. Now that the moment of truth was upon him, his nerves had decided to ratchet into overdrive. Tiny beads of sweat erupted on his palms as he stepped onto Daisy's porch, and he wiped them on his jeans before curling his hand into a fist and tapping at her door. When the door creaked open and Fanny was on the other side, Hunter almost sighed in relief. The elderly woman was feisty, but she would also tell it to him straight. If he had no chance with Daisy, she wouldn't hesitate to let him know. She stared at him for a moment before the corners of her lips twitched, lifting into a smile.
What took you so long?
He returned the smile and shrugged his shoulders.
I had to get some things in order first.
They better be the right things. It's been miserable around here since you left.
I hope they are,
he said, a serious expression returning to his face. He hated that he'd caused any more pain to Daisy and her family.
Is she here?
She's out back in the barn.
Hunter nodded.
Don't tell Cody I'm here yet. I want to make sure Daisy doesn't run me off first.
Your secret is safe with me.
She flashed him a wink and then leaned forward as if sharing a clandestine secret.
He's busy moping in his room anyway.
Hopefully we can fix that soon.
Well, get on it then. You're not going to get that accomplished standing here shooting the breeze with me. Go on, shoo.
She waved him out of the doorway, and before he could respond, she'd shut the door in his face.
All right then,
he said with a slight chuckle as he headed toward the barn.
I guess that's settled.
Chapter 18. Daisy. Daisy sighed as she heard the barn door creak open. Surely the sheriff wasn't back again. She'd felt badly being so forthright with him the last time he'd been here, but at least it had seemed to work for a while. "What can I do for you today, Sheriff?" The words died in her throat as she looked up to see not the sheriff, but Hunter Garrison standing a few feet from her. Though she didn't want it to, her heart drummed a little faster, and a thread of hope sparked in her. "What are you doing here?" Angry. She was supposed to be angry at him, but he looked so good in his dark jeans and flannel shirt that it was hard to remain that way. His wavy brown hair held that tousled, fresh-out-of-bed look, and her fingers itched to touch it, to find their way to the back of his neck and pull him close.
I realized I left without paying you. Even though I didn't totally finish my week, I wanted to fulfill my end of the agreement.
Oh. Disappointment surged through her. She should be happy. After all, he'd lied to her and left without paying her. But in the deepest parts of her heart, she'd been hoping he would come back and fight for her.
I'm not one to leave an obligation unfulfilled,
he continued, taking another step toward her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Then he held it out to her. "I guess that's a good trait to have," Daisy said, as she took the envelope. He nodded, and then stared at her as if waiting for her to open it in front of him. It felt awkward, but she slid her finger under the seal and popped the flap open. Instead of the cash she expected to find, or a single check, a stack of folded papers stared back at her. Curious, she pulled them out and unfolded them. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. "Is this for real?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "You're giving me the land on either side of me?" Hunter nodded as a smile spread across his features.
I am. I'm hoping that you'll allow my company to help establish a youth camp and a dude ranch on the land, but it belongs to you.
"Why would you do this?" Daisy couldn't make this gesture compute with the man who had lied to her and come to try and take her land.
Because you deserve it.
He took a step closer to her.
Because I know you'll do great things with it.
His next step brought him within touching distance.
And because I care for you.
Close. He was too close. The words she wanted to say dried up in her throat as the pounding in her heart grew louder. What? It was all she could manage to squeak out, and still it was barely a whisper.
I care for you.
His hand brushed her hair behind her ear, sending a river of goosebumps down her flesh.
I wasn't lying when I told you I'd fallen for you. You made me see what I was missing in life, what was really important.
But what about your company? A fog still enveloped her head, and the words felt hard to form. All she could concentrate on was the warmth from his hand as it rested against her neck. Won't you lose your job?
Even if I did, it would be worth it. But that's the best news. Standing up to Mr. Goldman and advocating for my own idea for the company was what my father was looking for. The company is mine.
It's yours?
She felt stupid, as if she were repeating questions she already knew the answers to. It's all mine, and the land is all yours. But I'm hoping you'll let me run the businesses with you. I know you said you didn't need a man, but I need you.
His fingers trailed down her neck and out to her chin.
So, will you? Will you let me back in your life?
His brown eyes bored into hers, and Daisy said the only word she could grasp at the moment. Yes. Hunter's eyes lit up, and his lips broke into a wide smile moments before they brushed against hers. A warm heat spread across her lips and then traveled through her body to her toes. It had been so long since she'd been kissed, and this one ignited parts of her body that had been dormant for far too long. As if on instinct, her arms wound around his neck, and she pressed herself tighter against him. Her fingers found his hair, and it was as soft as she'd thought it would be. His fingertips caressed her cheeks before tangling themselves in her hair as well.
Well, that was better than I even imagined, Hunter said softly, when he finally pulled back.
Desire swam in his eyes, and Daisy was sure hers were a mirror image. She fought to bring her heartbeat back to a normal rhythm. You imagined kissing me? He chuckled and ran his thumb across her lips.
Only every day since the festival.
Liar, she said, swatting his chest. She'd meant the word as a jest, but he caught her hand and held it to his heart. His expression turned serious as he searched her eyes.
I'm sorry I started our relationship with a lie, but I promise you that I will never lie to you again.
Relationship? If that's where this was headed, Daisy had to make one more thing clear. Hunter, I'm glad you're back, and I can't thank you enough for the land. But if you truly want a relationship with me, there is one thing you'll have to do. A shadow of doubt flickered across his face, but before he could say anything, she hurried on. I know you stated that you don't have a relationship with God, but that's important to me. Cody already lost the most important man in his life. I can't become serious with any man who doesn't put God first.
Hunter's eyes held her gaze. I know I said I didn't have a personal relationship with God, but I cannot deny that his hand was involved in bringing me here and meeting you. I can no longer ignore his existence, and I don't want to. I'm not sure how to proceed, but if you'll help me, I'd like to develop a relationship with him the way you have. I want to be the man you need.
Daisy could hardly believe her ears. She felt like pinching herself to make sure this wasn't a dream. I'd be happy to help you.
Good.
With that, he kissed her again, and Daisy finally let every piece of the wall she'd built to protect herself and her son fall away. Though there would undoubtedly be hard times in the future, she knew that with Hunter by her side and God leading them both, they could make it through those hard times together. Epilogue. 4 months later. Hunter watched as the workers strung the final banner between 2 large poles announcing the Garrison Keller Horse Youth Camp open for business, and squeezed Daisy's hand. Though they had started construction on both the Dude Ranch and the youth camp, they had both decided the camp was more important to the town.
Can I go try out one of the horses and the games?
Cody asked beside them. Energy emanated from him like a charged ion bouncing around a container. Hunter wasn't sure how he'd managed to stand still so long as it was.
Yes, go play. Your friend should be here soon.
Fanny had gotten word out about the opening and managed to convince half of the townspeople to volunteer their services so the kids could try everything out on the first day. Not only did it increase the promotion of the camp, but it would also allow them to see if there were any bugs that needed to be worked out before paying customers showed up on Monday. As Cody bounded toward the large game hall, Daisy turned to Hunter. Tears glistened in her eyes, and her voice was constricted with emotion as she spoke.
Thank you. This is beautiful. It's everything I hoped to see in this place once upon a time.
Hunter wiped an escaped tear from the corner of her eye and smiled at her. I'm happy to help. This will be so good for Cody and for the town. And you're right, it is beautiful, but not as beautiful as you. A dusting of pink, the color of the setting sun, flared on her cheeks, and she leaned into his hand.
Hunter.
He didn't know what she planned to say next. Probably something about how she wasn't the most beautiful woman in the world, or how he needed his eyes checked. Those were her usual answers when he opened his heart to her, but he wasn't going to let her get away with that tonight. Not tonight, when the small black box burned a hole in his pocket. Not tonight, when he'd suffered through the entire day, knowing he would ask the question, but having to wait for the perfect time. I mean it, Daisy. You took my breath away when I first met you. Then I saw a beautiful, feisty, confident woman. Now I see even more of you. I can no longer imagine my life without you and Cody in it. And though I know it hasn't been long, there's something I need to ask you. As his hand snaked into his pocket, he saw her eyes widen. Shaky hands flew to her mouth as he retrieved the small velvet box. How unassuming it looked on the outside, but everyone knew what the black box symbolized. He'd practiced all day what he was going to say, how he would string the words together so they would be a proposal she would never forget. But as he dropped to his knee and stared up at her, all of his carefully planned thoughts flew out of his head. He stared up at her. Daisy, I never thought I'd like life in a small town or on a ranch. I never enjoyed getting dirty before, but you showed me everything I was missing. Now, I can't wait to spend every evening watching the sun set with you, and every morning watching the sun rise. He flipped the lid open and smiled when she gasped, Will you marry me? Hunter had never seen Daisy without words, but for a moment she stared at him before nodding and throwing herself at him. The impact took him by surprise, and he lost his balance, falling to the ground with Daisy on top of him. Can I take that as a yes? He asked with a laugh. Yes, of course yes. Before he could place the ring on her hand, she had lowered her face to meet his lips with her own. Careful to hold on to the box, he returned the kiss, wrapping his arms around her. Though the position was awkward and the situation amusing, he knew he would never tire of kissing her. Would you like to put it on? He asked when the kiss finally ended. Daisy nodded and sat back enough that he could scramble to his knees once again. He pulled the ring out of the box and slid it onto her finger. It's perfect, she said, her voice breathy. Her eyes flicked to his. You're perfect. I love you, Hunter Garrison. I love you too, Daisy, and I can't wait to make you my wife. He leaned forward to kiss her again, and as he did, a feeling of peace and contentment settled over him. Though he never would have expected it, he knew this was exactly where he was supposed to be. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a review. It really does help.